Andrew Luber and Thomas Wynn and Clayton. Y'all so beautiful. I really enjoyed your talk with Javier the other day. That was a lot of fun. Annihilation. I just finished that this morning, and thank you for your kind words, Luber. I'm so glad you sent that email. You know, you wouldn't be here without that email. So I'm so glad you did. Just like Clayton commented on that integral stage video. I'm so glad he did. And so that all worked out. But it's wonderful to see you. Yeah, I was thinking a lot. So there's a few things. I like the science of beauty. We also, Mr. Luber, still need to talk about why economics and the science of lack go together. I just had all 4 of my tires replaced. And boy, howdy, there's nothing like a hit to your bank account than having 4 tires of a car replaced at the same time. Mr. Jockin, you guys had a great talk. But yeah, it's very interesting. So the science of beauty, I think is really important. The word science, you know, can mean in German a rigorous study. Science as a scientific method being like, what would it like? The scientific method, as Jonathan Rout stresses, is where any given person would have the same experience, right? So what that would mean is if I was in the laboratory or Andrew was in the laboratory or Billy Bob Thornton was in the laboratory, they would have the same experience. That's the scientific method, that the person involved is interchangeable. So there's a question on if the science of beauty would be one in which anyone under those conditions would have the experience of beauty, or is it a rigorous study of the conditions that make beauty possible, right? Because the difference with like a scientific empirical study is that, again, it's very easy to interchangeably move out the subjects. What's interesting with beauty is it seems strongly tied to the conditions of the subject, what conditions the subjects meet who enter into the space to encounter that beauty, right? And we were talking last week about the notion of the net, the human coordination problem, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin, and the social coordination problem, whereas we have pricing mechanisms that make it possible for the coordination of resources, the distribution of resources, and so on and so forth. There's something to be said where Zoom seems to make it possible to coordinate people together who meet the conditions of being able to experience beauty. And thus, the kind of like rigorous study of beauty could possibly be what do the people do who meet those conditions? How did they meet those conditions? What is their biography? What is their life story? What is the kind of topics that have to be met so it comes up? It does seem as if maybe we can't think of the science of beauty as being interchangeable like the empirical study where anyone can enter the laboratory, because it seems to be very conditional. But that still leaves open the rigorous study of the conditions of beauty. And maybe actually we needed Zoom or the internet for the coordination of humans that meet those conditions so that we can have enough of the kinds of people who meet those conditions to figure out what those conditions are. So maybe the technology is now available for kind of figuring those different things out. And then that question is tied to this notion of a sithone community or sithone belonging, or belonging, again, that is not based on an authority structure. Because if, in fact, you are able to find people that find belonging in that negative pragmatism of the uselessness or the letting being be or the annihilation of beauty coming forth without, say, an authority figure, then actually the social coordination mechanism of Zoom might bring together people of whom we can observe the conditions that need to be met so that you can have belonging that is not based on a neurotic structure, but a sithone structure. I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin. I have also been thinking about this problem of the beautiful collapsing into the good, but the good being something about the letting of the possibility of the beauty. But I just think your discussions were marvelous. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir.
Well, good to see everybody, and I'm calling from New York. I'm actually giving a talk on some of these topics tomorrow. So I think this is just very appropriate. You're talking.
Excellent.
So, low battery power, but it's good. Okay. So that example of the scientific method, right? The interchangeability of the instrument of measurement, right? That's kind of the key. The problem of the arts is that the instrument is the human soul, right? That's the biggest problem. And actually, so the riff on some points I'm going to talk about tomorrow, the problem is whenever we have any kind of object of observation that is multifaceted in its qualities. So for example, like cognitive function, right? There's working memory, there's spatial temporal relationship, visualizations, there's language, there's all these different aspects of it, qualities about it. The problem is getting an average of any of those kind of combinational factors together and flattening them down to an average will create a virtual average. meaning that the subjects that the aggregation that generated that average, there's no one representative of it in the average. And this happens a lot also in a lot of that's actually quasi, I mean, that's intellectual, but anything that has kind of extreme distributions, this is a huge problem. So fuck capital, basically. The joke is you put in a room, put Bill Gates enter a room or Elon Musk enters a room, everyone's a millionaire on average, but they're not in actuality. So the problem is the average, which is the major instrument of the scientific method, is a virtual object that has some interesting properties, but that is what allows for interchangeability. It's between subjects that allows for scientific methods to be analyzed. The artistic experience, the aesthetic experience, it's the positing of the individual, right, of the individual soul as an instrument to resonate with particular. I use the language instead of the virtual average, the exemplar pole of orbiting. So the point is that basically, no matter, it's kind of using kind of regardless of the initial conditions of that subjects enter up, by them being in a polar relationship to some orbiting lack orientation, they orbit basically around it and kind of coordinate indirectly by that. That the aesthetic and the beautiful would seem to have that quality where it's independent of some virtual average that you can just interchange and get the same result. Because that's the point, is that any the particular subjects inside that pole space that kind of orbit would be clearly distinct from each other, but yet they're kind of in an asynchronous, they're kind of in a synchronicity, a causal connection by that orbit pole that we can call a lack of some kind or exemplar. So just a riff on the first point, and we talked privately about the whole question from the Luber and Javier discussion about. I think I talk about this in my talk tomorrow. This whole problem of the collapse of the beautiful to the good. It's so easy. It is deceptively easy. In fact, I made a comment. I think I talked to Luber about this too. Most designers, they're engineers, just by a different name. They're not actually artists. They're engineers because they address a good by a measured quantum, and if in the face of uncertainty and constraints. But that's what engineers do. It's the same thing. My claim is in the talk is to revive what would the artists do, which would have to be an approach of the beautiful as our measure, not the good. But it's so easy to collapse into it. As I said before, it was like the idea of propaganda is the best sign of it. When a kind of a kind of positional good is strangling the art and overpowers the aesthetic experience to be about this is a good experience, right? Because of that the propaganda or the messaging got overpowered to the aesthetic experience itself. So I'll take leaps from there.
Excellent. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, and I would love to be at that talk. They are very lucky to get to hear you live. That is magnificent, and I wish you the best in that. No, I think there's a few things that come up in the same way that we have to work very hard to keep love from, say, collapsing into like, or to keep, it's interesting too, like Pei in the Real Talk on Belonging and Get a Philosophy portal was talking about this tension between obligation and belonging, where you can feel an obligation in a community to participate or to be there, or you're a bad person. Cheeton, good to see you, sir. And yet, so obligation threatens belonging, so you can collapse belonging into obligation, but at the same time, belonging seems to require some sort of commitment. So what's the difference between commitment and belonging? Commitment and obligation and belonging. What's the difference between love and like? What's the difference? It's interesting too, because when you mention the good, a lot of people say this is good pizza, right? But that's not the same as being good at the violin or good in a sort of deeper sense, right? So there's a problem where there are many senses of all of these different words, and it's as if language in general has a tendency to collapse, simply because whenever you use a word, the human being is making a decision of what signifier they think would best get at what they are feeling or undergoing. And many times it's like picking a ingredient for a recipe, and you just go what's at hand, and what's at hand may work, but it comes at the cost of maybe dulling the distinct meaning of the term. So you bite into pizza, and what comes to mind quickly is, oh, it's good versus it's tasty. Or, oh, it's kind of got a rustic taste on the pepperoni, and when you get to the cheese, it's a little oozy, and then it's more breaded. That would actually be more accurate, but that's not so at hand. What's at hand is more of good. And it works because everyone at the table knows what you're trying to signify when you say good, but the problem is with time, the convenience of using that term creates a certain dullness of description, or a dullness of the term good, that then it becomes confusing when you try to talk about ethical goods, or maybe the kind of good that leads to a virtue that is able to be open up to the experience of the beautiful, right? So there's, funny enough, there's a way in which we are always being trained according to our habits of description. And if we're not careful, those habits of description can lead to certain dullings of language that can prove kind of problematic. And I think what you're saying there about the beautiful is quite, because when you see something beautiful, you say, oh, that's good. And there's a way that that's true. But I've been thinking a lot between the difference, and then I'll pass it to Luber without getting into it, is a lot between the difference of that beatific vision, that strike of beauty, and the beauty people tend to associate with a set table or a well-designed house. So we say, oh, that's beautiful. But there seems to be a difference between that set. I know we were saying on in the messaging, this difference between a symmetry. There's a certain pleasing symmetry. There seems to be a difference between aesthetic and beauty, maybe is the term. I'll have to think about it. I've been creating a new term, which is always dangerous, but there seems to be a difference between aesthetic and beautiful, and likewise between beings, or a being and being, like Thomas Wynne was pointing out, right? And so that's interesting. And the interchangeability is very interesting. And I wonder if the science of beauty has to be, because it seems like you can't so readily make the subject interchangeable because it has something to do with the virtue and conditioning of the subject, but there's some sort of maybe apprehension that should be a constant variable of someone who experiences the beautiful, a kind of way of apprehending that becomes more consistent. I'll have to think on that, but let me give it. Yes, Mr. Jockin, please.
Jump in quickly, so I don't want to jump in a cycle on this, but that I've been meditating on that point. We just brought up that aesthetic beauty distinction. But the thing is, the language, that word aesthetic comes from the Greek for experience, sensation, right? That's not cologne. So beauty that's used in the Greek is cologne. So that's a really great example where, again, we think of aesthetics as the study of beauty, but it might be because by that very choice of language, we've went down a certain route of a misunderstanding, like and love, as you just demonstrated right there. So I think that's actually a very powerful point right there. So I just want to
because I've been thinking so much about a book that Samuel Barnes referenced in Missing Axioms on the aesthetic of the cherry blossom in Japanese culture, and how that was used to actually convince people to be kamikaze bombers, which then would allude to like Nazi Germany, Wagner music. And there's some sort of aesthetic that is dangerous that gets conflated with this strike of beauty, which may be the strike of being, to think that, as Wynne was talking, that seems to be different, but very similar. That has to be thought. But let me pass it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir, and I certainly have enjoyed your recent exchanges. So it's good to see you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, that was a great conversation we had. I've been thinking a lot about it. I was thinking a lot about it in the moment as well, struggling with a lot of different notions, because there's a tension. There's this underpinning tension that I felt between Jockin and Wynne in a certain sense, and a good tension, nothing bad, for the sake of something fruitful to come good. I have a lot to say. I guess, well, first on a light note, I would say this is like the dinner table being set, but there's nothing. It's not a strike. It's nothing striking me. It's like so classic, a dog sleeping, like whatever. There's something very whatever. We're at, like, I feel like we're at an age where that aesthetic dimension is very much whatever. I'm used to it. I see it. It's overload. It's all over the internet. That beautific vision you're making me think is just not even something that is something that the internet can penetrate. It's not something that you can experience on the internet, which is kind of going against what I was thinking on the last net session, where I was postulating the internet and the real world are basically the same. So there's something to that, but I need to sit with that for a little bit more before I comment further. But I would say that, well, first, one thing that I was thinking a lot about in our conversation was Jockin, when he was talking about the paradigm of attentionalism, the sentiment of attention. And I do think there's a certain irony that is happening where when you are intentionally trying to get someone's attention, Daniel, I assimilate that with like trying to be entertaining. Like you are just trying to be entertaining. What actually happens is it's not, you don't get a deep engagement, you get a passive engagement, you get more of a gloss. And it kind of makes sense why video games are becoming more and more apparent, more and more of an industry than even the entertainment industry in a certain respect. Because what happens is the entertainment industry is providing this, I'm trying to be entertaining, I'm trying to make you pay attention. So actually, you are not actually paying attention, you're glossing over it. So you turn to video games where you actually can get a sense of community. Like you could play Call of Duty or like Halo or Fortnite or whatever those games are, be locked in, super focused, talking to your friends. Like there's like, you feel like there's stakes, you're doing it with your friends and whatnot. And there seems to be something about video games that does, and at this moment in time in the world, provide the condition for actual attention by virtue of not trying to say, here, pay attention. There's something that they're focusing more on, like the precondition in a certain sense to what makes attention even possible. And that's why actually you find that like real engagement is more in the video game world than in the movie world. Like, for example, I watched Furiosa last night. I'm like looking at it, was a 2.5 hour movie. It was fine. It was whatever, in my opinion. I was looking at the phone a lot. I can't do that if I'm playing video games with my friends or I die. Like there's something there's something about the environment of video games that doesn't even allow me to wander. Like I'm just so locked in, just like this conversation. Like even when I wander in my mind, it's insofar as this conversation is like, it's within the bounds of the conversation, within the subject matter in a certain sense. So I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that, Jockin or whoever, just about like the whole notion of we're living in a world of attentionalism, like trying to get your attention, and that's like the baseline. But funny enough, you're not actually getting their attention. Something else is happening, and like it's obfuscating what attention even is, and it's changing what it means for us humans what attention is, and in a bad way. I wanna suggest another thing with like what you're saying, Daniel, the constant apprehension. Like I don't mean to keep saying like talking about it, but for me that it's theme, like the constant apprehension of something in a universal manner. Not that you have to think about it in a singular way for you to apprehend it, but that theme in a certain sense shapes the individual's apprehension as it relates to the universal principle. And that to me is like a fine place to play with in terms of having like that constant. So I just wanted to say that, but also at the same time, like Jockin really got me thinking with my book, am I collapsing the beauty into the good? Like, am I doing that? Because in a certain sense, I do focus a lot on goodness, but goodness, where I'm at with it, and like, please feel free to say it, I am, like, it's okay. Like the truth is whatever it is, you know? But goodness is only based off of the context and how that context has some significance toward you. Beauty comes in when you are thinking about the significance toward you. So you can really clarify what goodness is, but you'll get to a point where you'll have to talk about value. And value has to do with significance. And what shapes value and significance is ultimately the beatific vision, that strike. Like when you realize you go on a good walk, as opposed to, let's say you go on a walk every day at 4 o'clock, and then you're able to make a distinction where this walk today on Thursday was actually a good walk as opposed to Wednesday. even though more or less we're coming into it with the same mentality. Something happens that you weren't expecting that actually brings the value to the forefront and makes the significance very transparent, where you're able to say, that was a good walk. This was a good conversation. And you have to use the language of good in a certain sense to mediate this strike, this penetration. So I do wonder, and like, this is like an ongoing question, you know, I do wonder at what point, if you use the language of good, is it appropriate to talk about beauty? And how, in what context, in what ways? Or is it just the case where it's like anytime you're coming at it from goodness, you're immediately collapsing the beauty into the good? Like, or in other words, like, to use the language that we've been saying so far, where does the soul meet the existential interface or images? At what point does soul meet the interface? And is it okay for us to talk about the soul via the interface at all? Or if we do talk about the soul via the interface, are we just collapsing the soul into the interface? So I wanted to ask that question. I also really want to hear you talk about the economics more. I was going, you have so many videos, Daniel. You know what I just realized? I need to check your playlist. You probably do have a playlist of like the economic aspect of the science of lack. I really want to understand more about that as well. And then one last thing that I just was personally thinking about that I do think it has to do with the other stuff that I'm talking about is that, like, so this is very Lacanian. Like with what you're saying, the words, when we say words, they have some signifier. Is it possible to have a conversation that's focused on the signification itself and not just the word play? So in other words, is it possible to even speak about that dimension of that which signifies all words with words? Or is it just like hopeless? Because to me, the storyteller, they're in the dimension of signification. Like, they're trying to figure out what needs to be signified before they figure out the particulars, before they figure out the words. It's almost reverse, where like the philosopher to me is focusing on what particular words are at play and what are their significations. And like, is there any problems with their significations, or is there a better way to like express their significations? I'm sure there's other dimensions that the philosopher plays with, but that's just what's coming to mind at the moment. I'll pass it off. Love you guys. This is great.
And we love you. And actually there is a playlist, but if you click it, it just goes to my secret videos about how to make money with passive income, because the best way to make passive income is videos about making passive income. So I just have a lot of those. It works really well. The best passive income are actually videos or courses on making passive income. Who knew? So there's a few things. And I'll pass it to Wynn and then Clayton. As you were talking about attention, it's kind of funny because it's almost like attention has to be at tension. Like, you can't have attention unless there's tension. And I think you see that, right? Heidegger's example, the doorknob breaks, then you notice there's attention. Something breaks, then you have attention. And a lot of times the irony is people are trying to get attention with dopamine or by making everything feel good. And that seems to work to some degree, but eventually there's no tension. So then it doesn't catch your attention. You become numb. And that's kind of the funny thing, is a lot of the entertainment industry tries to create attention by a mechanism of pleasure that ironically leads to a certain numbness. And that makes me think of the saturation, as Mr. Ebert would say. And one of the hopes I have is in this attentionalist economy, its efforts to create attention through pleasure are going to saturate itself, kind of break it in a way and force people to think of a sublation, which would involve, I think the video game example is wonderful, because there's a tension there that requires your focus and the development of a skill, because you have to get good at the game. You don't want to get killed, right? So this is interesting because attention that has a possibility of failure, which feels good to succeed versus feel good to consume, plus some kind of skill, might be getting at the variables of a science of beauty. I definitely think that video games are closer to a science of beauty as a medium, and maybe Zoom conversations and other things. And I'm just very, very lucky that there's no remake of Perfect Dark from the N64 that's around today, because boy, howdy, my brothers and I had a great time with that one. You know, that was stylish. You know, that was still of the GoldenEye era before all the frickin' Halo took over, whatever. Or Street Fighter, because Street Fighter 3 is the greatest fighting game ever. Anyway, so there's something about the dynamics of the video game that suggests a certain tension. And I think basically what's interesting is on this question of what are the conditions necessary for the science of beauty. It may have something to do with the negative pragmatism. You know, I know Javier was also talking with Julia Resch, and I thought it was one of Resch's, quite a good talk from her. And she was saying this idea that she's fighting use so that it opens up for the pure relation. Like, you know, like if you're not talking about, you know, the problem with hope is it's external of the relation. It's away, right? And you're not present. Or the problem with use is you're thinking about using the things to a mean. So there's this kind of idea of removing everything that takes away from the focus of a relation, right? Yeah, I love Q. I could really get me with some Dudley, man. Dudley, the boxer guy, Jockin. Oh, I love that character. He was the man. Scott and I would just fight all night. Anyway, so there's this notion. What's interesting, though, in that space of annihilation or letting, there's a tension. This is what's interesting, is the negative pragmatism as creating a place of no hope or no use in the sense of you're just letting be the situation. A tension arises because you want to bring in a solution. You want to bring in a practical thing, right? So maybe there's a way when we talk about negative pragmatism, it's actually, funny enough, creating a place of tension that makes real attention possible. And that real attention is actually a condition necessary for beauty to come forth. Because I guess in the same way that in order to do a scientific experiment, there are certain conditions that have to be met, right? You have to have the, you know, the laboratory has to be stable. You know, you can't be introducing new variables. You have to have a constant. In order to get a scientific conclusion, there are variables that have to be met, right? Maybe, just to start, the condition that must be met for a science of beauty to come forth or to be traced out or to be considered requires precisely a negative pragmatism to arrive at. That is then removing use, removing externalities, of which then, funny enough, creates a tension precisely in that lack of externalities. You would think that would free you of tension, but actually it increases tension because the soul is like, the soul does it. Did you know the soul sounds like that actually? If it's not able to run, it sounds exactly like that. That's actually the scientific frequency. And so then you're in that tension, and that now creates a different kind of attention that is not the attention that's dopamine based, but it's actually the intention. It's almost like an attention that is virtue based. Like, I'm here. This is really hard. Okay, that kind of attention. And now maybe that's the attention of letting. And then I'll give it to Mr. Wynn. Like, that's the attention of the annihilation that now is the letting. And now the condition, the laboratory per se, has been set where the possibility of beauty coming forth as distinct from mere aesthetic can occur. There's more to be said, but let me pass it because I do think a problem in all this is there's seemingly a word, like we're saying, between aesthetic and beauty that has to be considered. Because I think when we think of beauty really as this particular strike, this strike of something coming forth versus the table being set, that can start us to help on thinking why it is beauty could help with a new kind of belonging, why it is that beauty as a strike cannot be collapsed. Oh, I had things to say on good to the significant degree, because I don't think your book is actually, well, this is where it gets tricky, and I'll pass it to Wynn before getting into it, because in the book with the basketball example, there's a notion that good is meeting a certain sufficient degree, right? So funny enough, You can say, oh, you're being good at negative pragmatism if to a sufficient degree you're not bringing in use or bringing in hope or things that distract, right? So you're meeting the condition to then have the theme come forth, right? This is what's weird. There's some sort of, you need to be good at the setting the stage per se. The good at, oh, I am sufficiently not letting use get in the way. I am sufficiently not letting hope or some sort of trying to solve the things get in the way. Therefore, something can come forth. But before getting into that, yes, Mr. Luber, please.
Sorry, Win. Let me just quickly just squeeze in. That's like my whole thing that I was getting really caught up in with like what Jockin was saying, because I think with like the beauty collapsing good is very provocative for me. Like I've been wrestling with that since the conversation, honestly. And there's this, what I can't escape though, is that there has to be a content. There has to be context. There has to be a certain threshold that's met in order for beauty to be able to like reveal itself. Like you can't say, for example, it was a beautiful walk if you're not walking.
Yeah.
And like, so I get very confused. I just feel like the goodness, I know you're not talking shit on goodness, but there's a certain imperative of thinking maybe in terms of goodness first in a certain way that will allow them for beauty to strike. Because I just don't see how it's possible to think, maybe I'm just not getting there, but like beauty first and then seeing how it can be good the other way.
But this is a tremendous question that may get us into, without bringing up, when you read some of the biographies of like the mystics or the saints or some of the moral people, when they're very young, they have some sort of vision of something, that there is this kind of vision of the beautiful and then it goes away and they spend their life trying to meet the conditions of that thing that they experienced. So there is this weird history of like visions or people having glimmers or seeing exemplars, and there's a glimmer of it, and then that goes away for the majority, for like 20 years as they work to be good, but actually a glimmer of eternity, a glimmer of the beautiful was at the start of it. This is a kind of biography question that's very interesting. Practically speaking, after the glimmer, if you will, for a lot of these mystics or saints or people or artists or Faulkner seeing Caddy in a tree, practically speaking, the majority of their time is in fact trying to get good. But the whole reason they try to get good is because they had some weird vision of something when they were younger. I would have to expand on that because this gets into the mystery of the development of the human soul. Yay, but let me give it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn, it is good to see you, sir.
Always a pleasure, Nevin, sure. I tried to frame this a little bit by Hegel, then Heidegger, but now I'm going to frame it by O.G. Rose. And obviously everyone speaking here actually, because I think this conversation the other day, like the introduction of the beauty and the good, kind of surprised me a bit, and I think that's why there was a tension, because I was like, how can I frame this according to the question of being, And like I was finding like these similarities between like, I think what we can call the good is perhaps even relative knowledge. And I think Luber was referring to kind of what I would say is like the early middle Heidegger, where the project of being and time is to disclose the manifold meanings given to being and the kind of impossibility of stepping beyond those kind of historical, contingent, particular horizons within which we thematize things. Yeah. And so this is the question, like, I found it really useful last year to go through Heidegger's interpretation of Hegel, because Heidegger talks about the question of the difference between relative knowledge in Hegel and absolute knowledge. And so Hegel starts from the place of natural consciousness, which approaches things from a relative standpoint, like a relatum. So everything that we experience is seen to be like, I as the subject approaches the object through my relative particular position. And so we assumed mathematically, in terms of quantity, that absolute knowledge was always about accumulating a totality of knowing, of things, of quantifying those things and building a system up towards this kind of total whole. But Heidegger has this reading where he says, well, Hegel's not pointing to quantity, he's pointing to quality. So he uses he connects the word absolute to absolve, because there's a link there, really, really important link that for me relates to releasement. The only way to approach a type of knowledge which kind of, in a way, breaks through to this glimmer, and you can perhaps now bring this back into beauty, relative knowledge for Hegel breaks through the relativity by absolving knowledge and waiting in a way, and seeing what that means for consciousness. So he brings back in this idea of consciousness. And I just found a note which was really interesting on beauty, attacking beauty on my Word document, which says that so I made the note basically saying being for Hegel is also that which has nothing to do with actuality, insofar as being remains as, quote, the abstract universal, with which Greek philosophy conceived of it. As such, Greek thought for Hegel is that which remains at quote, the stage of beauty. The Hegel's critique against the Greeks, but what he develops from, is that the Greeks only could theorize this otherness to relative knowledge as the event of beauty, as the glimmer of beauty. And then you have the good which tries to attain beauty. And Jockin was the way he worded it. I can't even remember if it was yesterday or the day before. The way it always comes back to this question. And I think this is the way I do the main reason why I like Heidegger in a way. Like, I don't always agree with him, but he helps me frame it like, what was it for the Greeks that was the highest good? But in approaching it through the relative, or again, relative for them was not really a word, but for us it is, so let's use it. Like, through our relative knowledge, how do we attain that no thing which can't even be thematized, you know? And I think this again is how Heidegger approaches this question of being. Like, the way, and this goes to what you said at the end, Daniel, like the way that we have approached knowledge is we have this glimmer. Then for the rest of our life, we try to attach a good to it. We try to quantify it. We try to capture it because maybe it was that beautiful that we always have this desire to return in some sense. But I think this is Heidegger's point, that the history of philosophy has always just remained within the realm of the good. It's tried to attain, and it's tried to grasp, and it's tried to objectify, it's tried to move towards, you know. And as Hegel would say, like, that's where you have this perspective where you feel like you need to re-relate to it, like you need to re-attain it. And I think, and this is my hardcore point now, like, actually, I'm normally quite soft, you know, like context and listening, but I found a note on the origin of the work of art. Important for my own thinking. Basically, I could read this whole paragraph. If we are to read beauty into the letting, we can still follow Heidegger here in claiming that the appearance of beings, so basically, like, the whole philosophy I think gets to is to say that for Heidegger, truth is in this quality of releasement within which you wait and you live in the tension of the good. You live in that tension. You live in the recognition that you are always going to approach things relatively, in some sense, you know, within a certain horizon. But the point is, when you experience the silence of that moment, what you're disclosed to is no absolute good in and of itself, but the quality of being, a quality of relating, where you let that thing be, in that sense. You let whatever that thing is be. This is where beauty, I think, comes back into the equation. And I think there's a quotation here in terms of art, in the origin of the work of art. We can still follow Heidegger here in claiming that the appearance of beings in this let be quality is the disclosure of a being in its work, in what is created and so disclosed, in drawing us to the beauty of the fact that we are let be. As such, quote, appearance, as this being of truth in the work and as work, is beauty, end quote. Beauty then becomes nothing other than the exposition of that released and let be quality and its relation to all beings that are always already being let be. And I think this is why the question of being becomes important again, because the beauty becomes, in some sense, in this reading, like, determinable as nothing other than that which lets those relative horizons, the goods, kind of remain relative in some sense, kind of remain historical in that sense, you know. They remain particular to the freedom of human beings to thematize things, to create stories and narratives. But all the beauty is doing for you is to show you that those goods in themselves are relative to the event or disclosure of beauty. And that experience, waiting in that tension, bringing like those kind of like historical horizons to their limit in that sense, I think the event of beauty becomes a bit determinable. And I remember with Alex Ebert, when we had the thing with Cadell at the end of his, and we was talking about this letting be, and this is the first time I heard his idea of indeterminability. And I was like, in a way, like what letting's trying to do is in a way be a relative position from my mouth in some sense. And of course, it's like the word letting itself is historically produced, you know. So of course it's relative, but what it's doing is it's trying to show that what is not relative or what is absolute is the fact that beings letting us be in those particular moments, in our goods, in our differences. And I think perhaps this brings up the question that I would like to hear what everyone thinks, perhaps, if this is understandable in some sense, is can we, and I think this came from on the other conversation, can we have a good which is aware of what Zizek might call the limit of that good, the limit of that horizon, in order to wait in that experience? And so perhaps the good becomes, and this is a psychoanalytical good, like in the practice, a psychotherapeutical good in the practice, where you say, I can't change my situation by trying to grasp it and hold it. And this came up, the example with like the Nazis were trying to find the good by carrying out a specific ideological formation of exterminating the excess of those things that weren't German, la la la. But the good to be affirmed, the good to be applied practically as praxis, is to kind of wait, is to see what happens when you let that person be. And this is my kind of, there's a glimmer of my own future ideas in some senses, like what would that mean for the socio-economic world? What would it mean to let someone be? You know, of course, liberalism comes to mind, but then what if letting be is also a higher form of speculation, where you can ask certain questions about that quality of relating to each other in some sense? And I think, yeah, and I always talk about the letting. This is, I'm going to come off this topic in a while, I think. One final comment. I've just seen 3 highlights of beauty. What conceals beauty, then, in Heidegger's language, is Western metaphysics, because it obsesses in attempting to find beauty in the experience of objectifying a being or an idea as if that has itself a totalizing beauty, as if like that good's going to get you there. It's not. Perhaps in being open to the idea that it's not going to get you there, you're more willing to be on a walk in the woods and say, well, I'm not going to find beauty here. Like you can even say that. And it goes back to what Javier said about marketing and like the Dorito mountain thing. Like you're not going to find beauty in the Dorito itself. When you let that be, you might be surprised that next to the Dorito one, there's a sandwich mountain, you know, like with lettuce, you know, like you don't like there's all of these things that will at that point surprise you. And this is where surprise perhaps comes in, you know. So it's not about attaining beauty, it's about recognizing that you can't through the good. And that position, I think, is what we're kind of trying to talk about here in some sense. And then for me, what's interesting is the question of, does that bring with it an absolute knowing, or do things remain relative, you know? But for Hegel, the absolving is to release relative knowledge in a way to the sphere of science, to the sphere of the goods in some sense, because then we can build tables and we can, you know, go on the train or where the train is to walk in the woods, you know, because they've been created through ideas of what is good, i.e. walking or taking a train.
Magnificent. I'll give it to Clayton, and then Chetan, you said a lot there that was fantastic. So a few things come to mind. So on this notion of kind of a science of beauty, which we could think of as a kind of study of how the beauty comes forth, I think first off, it's very interesting because for me, when I read a lot of biographies to this question of the relation between beauty and good, it seems like most people start with a kind of inspiration, a kind of awe, a kind of experience where they go, wow, which then inspires them to get really good at that thing. But then what's very interesting is the next step actually for people who don't become pathological is more like a kind of releasement, which makes no sense, because if you work really hard to meet the condition of experience the beauty, then wouldn't you like not want to give it up? But there's some sort of working really hard. You're inspired to work really hard at something. And then the third leg is some sort of letting be, some sort of letting it occur. But because you did the work to a sufficient degree, when you let, that has a different quality, a different kind of experience than if you don't do the work, which is very mysterious. But because you work to a good sufficient degree, to Luber's book, then when you let be, that allows something to occur that otherwise does not occur. Now, the question is, why? Is there some sort of active principle in reality that comes forth? Is there essence? You know, all of these different questions. You know, what is it that makes this thus? But it's interesting to think that on the study, it might be inspiration, which is a glimmer of the beautiful that's very quick and very fleeting, that then leads to a whole lot of work at getting good, that then ends with maybe a kind of truth where you realize that I actually can't ever be good enough to totally escape privation. You know, Jockin was mentioning even the best require mercy from God, right? Like the truth is I actually can't ever achieve enough of us. You can achieve goodness to a sufficient degree to realize that goodness never equals beauty, which is really weird. Like the sufficient degree of goodness is when goodness is sufficient enough for you to remove plausible deniability that the good can ever become the beautiful. And that's precisely when the beautiful comes forth and you say, wow, this is good. Which then makes it seem like it's the good, but the reason you're saying, wow, this is good is because you've reached the sufficient degree of the letting, right? This seems to be getting at the kind of conditionality. And on the question of is it relative, and then I'll pass it to Clayton and Chetan, it seems to be conditional is the word I love to use, where you have to meet certain conditions for it to occur, that then in a way is relative to you meeting those conditions. But theoretically, if anyone met those conditions and had the conditions of your subjectivity as you had it, they would experience it. That could be the claim, where you have an objectivity to beauty, even if you have a particular. This is what's weird. Beauty seems to be particular, but not mere taste. And this is where a term I've been exploring creating that I think is leading to confusion on this question. As we were saying, there seems to be a difference between aesthetic and beauty. And I think, like you were saying there, Mr. Wynn, on this idea of beautiful as this kind of totalizing vision, I think the problem is most of the time when people talk about beauty, they're talking about something I want to call a meta-aesthetic. And the reason I call it a meta-aesthetic is because I have in mind the meta-narrative that Lyotard critiqued, right? Like he said, we can't have any meta-narratives, like these single narratives to explain reality. You can't have a theory of everything. I think most of the time, like if I think of those cherry blossoms, there's a notion of a meta-aesthetic, which is if you're doing what you're supposed to do as a Japanese soldier, you will look like this. You will be in this plane. You will have this kind of aesthetic to you, right? And then what ends up happening is you want to look like a cherry blossom, which is beautiful, but fleeting. So you die young as a kamikaze fighter, right? So there's a kind of fittingness that comes with a meta-aesthetic. Or I think about the Nazis, or I think about what does a middle-class person, like in the book Distinctions by Pierre Baudelaire, he talks about how taste is used to oppress, right? Like if you're middle class, you should look like X, Y, and Z. You should eat at McDonald's. You should have not too big of a house. And if you don't, if you have like some kind of dignity, or you walk, or you listen to classical music in your middle class, it's like, you don't meet the aesthetic, right? You don't meet the meta-aesthetic. And by meta-aesthetic, the problem is it's a kind of theory of how everything in your life should look if you are indeed of a cultured class, or if you are middle class or something like that. And so for me, a lot of times when we think about Nazis using beauty to attract, what they're actually doing is they have a meta-aesthetic that the culture then feels forced to align with, or they are pressured by the citizenship or the government because they don't have the aesthetic. They don't look like a good German. A good German listens to classical music and they stand outside when Hitler's going by. They meet certain aesthetics and they have a certain look to the house, right? That to me, when we talk about the bad beauty, is this meta-aesthetic. But when we're talking about it like Jockin and like this notion of beauty as this kind of glimmer, the problem is once we understand the difference between the meta-aesthetic, then we start to realize that the cherry blossoms with the kamikaze fighters is not actually beauty. It's a meta-aesthetic, ergo kind of like a meta-narrative, in a visual form to convince people to be kamikaze fighters and to be honorable and to look like good, strong young men who care about the empire. There's a meta-aesthetic. Likewise, under capitalism, there's a meta-aesthetic that you should follow to look like you work hard. And this is where the critiques of pragmatism are good, right? Because often pragmatism functions as a meta-aesthetic of what you're supposed to look like if you are practical, right? And all of this is very bad. In the same way that we have to defend truth, but then truth can be used to oppress, as Foucault taught, right? There's a bad use of truth. Likewise, you need the good, but then there's a dogma that can oppress that you need to deconstruct. So likewise, it seems as if there's a meta-aesthetic that can be socially used to control people that is actually neurotic-based. That is what we are saying that's the kind of fallen, problematic form of beauty. And once we understand that, then I think that opens up, when we're talking about a science of beauty, we are not talking about what we need to do to create a meta-aesthetic in a society, because that could be an oppressive narrative, that could be controlling, that could be manipulative, right? A science of beauty has something to do with a rigorous study of the conditions that a subject meets so that they can have a particular experience of beauty. And here's the other key. Although a meta-aesthetic can be totalized to control people, it does not seem like beauty can be totalized in that way. Once we make the distinction between beauty and meta-aesthetic, beauty is a glimmer that you had as a small kid because you were in that bathtub with Redwall. You're not going to be able to take over the citizenship with your story of Redwall in your bathtub when you were 4. You may be able to manipulate them with the propaganda of a meta-aesthetic using classical music to make them feel cultured to join the Nazi party. It's going to be real hard to politically manipulate people according to a inspirational glimmer that sets you on a path of getting good at something to a sufficient degree so that you could meet the threshold necessary to let the activity then get a life of its own so that beauty can come forth, not a meta-aesthetic. So I'm thinking that, and let me give it to Clayton Nyakana and then Mr. Luber. So I'm thinking that for a lot of people, it has something to do, like the life for beauty, seems like it starts in inspiration, then decades of like work and getting good at, to a kind of releasement or a letting, which is when the good is at the sufficient degree for that letting, and then beauty comes forth. But since you just spend 20 years getting good precisely for that inspiration, which in a way thus is good, because that's why you're doing it, it's easy to say that that glimmer of beauty is good because it is precisely the result of your getting good at something to let that thing come forth. But actually, the experience of beauty is distinct as the kind of trophy of the good, if you will, the kind of reward of the good that then actually inspires you to go on and do more and more, right? And so I think that's sort of meta-aesthetic, but let me pass it to Clayton Nyakana and then Mr. Luber. Clayton, please.
Wow, so much there to comment on. Yeah, but the one that really sticks out for me is Furiosa. With her. There's a scene in that movie where Jack, the rig driver, recruits Furiosa, and he comments about, like, the way to paraphrase it, he commends her on her virtue of purposeful savagery. And so, like, thinking about that in this whole context about beauty, like, trying to find the beautiful in a wasteland, right? I think it gives an interesting context to sort of like play with, because when you, and this is why, like, I really agree with what Thomas Wayne is saying about letting be. And for me, the way I like to think about it is there's a whole relationality thing, right? Like, there's this whole relational, like, we are relational beings, and like, as we relate, the more accurate that relation is, the more truth that comes forth for us, right? And it's not finite. It's always on a scale, and it's always evolving, depending on how well how good the grip is, or the grip is not even a good word. It's like how well attuned the relation is, right? Like the more aligned it is, the higher the sensitivity to the truth on offer. The less alignment sort of like is a bit, it could be better. We could align it better type thing. And so I think we are beings. I don't think we're the only kind of beings that do that. It's like it's all over nature. But there is like a need for that alignment, that proper alignment, maybe. And it's an aspirational thing because we happen to be in a dynamic, ever evolving scenario. Like even the rock on which we're practicing this aspiration is always spinning around in space. So just like we're always on the move, and our conditions are always on the move, and so we have to keep up with that and try to be at the optimal appetite for trying to get it. Yes? Yeah. Sorry, you're saying something.
No, it dropped for a second, and I was singing you back, and it worked because the frequencies of singing actually help the internet. You may not have known that, so if your internet doesn't work, just start singing friends. But please go on, Clayton.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I was saying that, and it puts us like because of that flux, like we want to aspire to want and hold it down and put it in a place and get it and contain it and say, we have got it. But like Thomas Finn was saying, like when you're on the walk in the woods, maybe you have to acknowledge that you're not gonna find it there. And in that letting be, then you can see what you can get the surprise. You can unlock the surprise of, oh, okay, here's what something I didn't consider. So anyways, without dragging on, those are some of the thoughts coming to me, and great talk, folks. I'll pass it back.
And I'll pass it to Cheeton, Mr. Luber, Mr. Jockin, Mr. Wynn, and Samuel Barnes. It is good to see you. I'm actually talking about that Kamikaze book that you referenced in Missing Axioms because I read it and it's perfect because it talks about, we're talking about beauty, but then also how there seems to be this kind of aesthetic that can manipulate and control people. And the symbolism of the cherry blossom in that book was really fantastic because, as an example, because it was an aesthetic that then people like the pilots could think about their life in light of, thus making them willing in order to be beautiful to actually go through with the kamikaze activity. And how that seems to be very different, though, than the kind of beauty that Plato is talking about in The Science of Beauty or the Glimmer of Beauty. And how do we think those distinctions? And to your point there, Clayton, I think that gets a bit when I'm thinking, like when Wynn was pointing out this idea of if you're thinking about something, how that kind of gets in the way. Like if you're thinking about being beautiful, there's a way in which that gets away in the encounter of the beauty. Like there's this way where the thought conceals, and there's almost like all you can do is get really, like to Luber's book, you get inspired, you see a glimmer of a possibility, you work to be very good at the corresponding art, skill, or activity of that inspiration. And then you get to the place where you actually accept your inability to summit on demand. But what you can do is choose to put yourself in situations where things can come forth. You can shoot, and that's where I think for me the absolute choice is big. Like you can continue to put yourself in the encounter with the other, or the net conversation, or reading the book, or starting the business. Because you can't, like if you're trying to, how do you think about beauty without that getting in the way of beauty per se? And then I'll give it to Cheeton. That doesn't seem to work because then there's an anxiety But you can know that doesn't work and then think to put yourself in the place where the possibility can come forth. Like you can choose to come to, you can choose to see people like at the net. You can choose to read a book. You can choose to sit down with the pen and paper and see if the book comes forth. You can choose to go onto the sports field after working at wrestling and see if that moment of magnificence comes forth on the soccer field. Or you can choose to try to write the story and to see if that moment occurs where the theme bursts forth. You can choose to put yourself in the place where the theme can come forth, and it's possible for that place to be a place where the theme comes forth or the beauty because you've arrived at the skill to a sufficient degree to work the conditions of the situation so that can occur, but it cannot be guaranteed. And so that's, to me, like it becomes in so much about putting yourself in the situation, choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to put yourself in a relationship that you don't try to manage in terms of use, pragmatism, all the stuff that Javier and everyone was talking about with Miss Resch. That's a choice of a situation that actually comes from thinking the realization that thought is in the way of this. But you have to get to the place where you can think that thought would be in the way of this, right? And then it's good to think that goodness is in the way of beauty, right? This is the weird move that occurs. That seems to be necessary. That seems to be part of the quote unquote science of beauty. But let me give it to Chiton. Chiton, it is good to see you, sir.
I'm great, actually. The live discussion going on. And it's a discussion that it's a question that I've been struggling with for quite some time. If you've asked me a year before what is beauty, I would have given you a very good, nice, long answer. But in the past year, I started sort of working on this question of aesthetic governmentality, where we are seeing that forms of power are taking an aesthetic turn in that sense, where earlier power depended upon rationality to sort of organize itself. Now power is getting organized around how something looks, So you can see this idea of, in third world countries, you're looking at this question of India trying to become China, or India trying to become Beijing or Singapore, or, and cities getting planning sort of decisions being taken upon those, how something would look in that sense, the first world, or look, even if that, so we have slums in our cities, very, very common thing. So when Donald Trump came to India, we covered the slums with a whole kind of, large wallpapers kinds, so that people do not see the slums, and then people are told not to come outside of their houses because the city would get in that. So beauty is a very interesting problem in that sense, and it's very difficult to get our heads around it. One of the problems in that sense of beauty very early, at least, and I'm just sort of meditating upon it with you all, because as I said, I don't have good answers anymore to the question in that sense. But if we think about it, beauty has some structural questions that we should ask. So one of the earlier questions was, is beauty part of the object? So Aristotle sort of saw it as a question of symmetry, finiteness, and suddenly you started realizing, especially with Kant. Kant made that radical turn where Kant argued that beauty is something that we as subjects bring to the object in that sense. It is a way in which our subjective feeling itself, our own effect itself sort of gains structure, where the object of inquiry itself becomes that. So very interesting questions sort of emerge with beauty. And one of the places that I trust beauty the most is actually when it sort of encounters rationality in its most crudest forms. For instance, in mathematics, most mathematicians will tell you that beauty or aesthetics is a very important criteria for their equations, because it's not. I remember reading a very nice paper by a philosopher called V. Sanil. He is in IIT Delhi in India, and he sort of gave an example of a mathematician who had sort of uncovered an equation which people thought is useless and has no meaning, and for him it was just a beautiful equation. And it turned out that that equation was used in quantum gravity much after his death, and so on and so forth. So beauty becomes a sort of a way of thinking about things where you cannot know what purpose they will solve later on. There's a purposiveness to beauty itself. It emerges as an end in itself in that sense, which is why it gets confused with good. The good also sort of deals with this question of ends, and that the confusion sort of emerges from that overlap to that degree. But beauty, in that sense, always has this very interesting problem that how does something which pertains or refers to the subject and not to the object can actually find meaning in the objective world. And that's the challenge in that sense, and we can see that history of that problem. And if we move forward, we will get into this question of appearance and essence problem in that sense, and immediately we start asking the question that this question of essence is a problem of that something sort of relies on the side of the subject, something sort of slips, and something structures the subjective experience itself. You may call it transcendental, you may want to do it to Hegelian dialectics, you may want to do it through any of these different theoretical approaches, but there is something structuring the subjective experience itself. In Lacan, also this question of symbolic, this whole Oedipal journey, is actually a problem of subject sort of anchoring itself in the symbolic. And there is something about that structure which always intersects with the problem of beauty. The challenge becomes that beauty still itself cannot be trusted. It still itself remains a category which can easily slip into domains of power. It's not free of that. So one of the ways you can think about it is that beauty can at certain moments beautifully sort of intersect with truth. It can really reveal some a truth to you, but it can also become something for which truth is hidden. Truth is hidden in that sense. I'm saying hidden. Truth is hidden. You can look at the whole fashion industry. You can look at the whole, in that sense. It's not necessary that all focus upon beauty itself leads to this sight of this mathematical, what it emerges in mathematics, in that how it emerges in mathematics or other theoretical choices. So the question for me becomes in that sense that what is the politics of beauty? And you're right, when beauty gets in some sense confused with good, because good is something which is not completely formed on the side of the subject. In that sense, good is not necessarily something which is simply, although Kant tried to sort of argue it in that manner that that good is the goodwill and so on and so forth. But good is something which hinges upon, in some senses, or encounters the object in a particular way, where sublimation, as we may call it, is not a necessary criteria for it. Good is something which is linked to. So how do we think about this problem of beauty in that sense, that the conflict it sort of causes for us, and what are the contours of this something which you cannot completely eradicate, which is the subject, but something which by virtue of it becoming part of the equation, it brings with itself its own criteria for truth in that sense, which has very difficult to, I think, anchor with the criteria for truth that object emerges with. I'm sorry I took too long.
No, I think this question, and I'll pass it to Luber, Jockin, Wynn, and Samuel. And Mr. Barnes, I'm looking forward to your recent talk with Mr. Hansen. And I see you also had a talk with Jacob Kashir. That looks fantastic. On this question, I mean, on the politics of violence, there's definitely this way in which aesthetics or appearances can be used as a certain violence. What's interesting to me is when I read about the aesthetic of the cherry blossoms, or I read about aesthetics as social taste with the book Distinction, or in sociology, or soft power with American hegemony, the way that aesthetics are used there seems very qualitatively different than when Faulkner is talking about seeing a vision of Caddy in a tree, and that's beautiful. Or these kind of moments of, there's this guy, and I forget his name, he was a French philosopher, seeing the earlobe of his daughter and speaking about that as a mystical vision of God, right? What's very interesting is these seem to have some sort of connection and yet are quite different. In the same way as well that the individual who would say every afternoon, go over and sit with an old, an elder, and just be there to take care of them without anyone knowing about it or any sort of social acknowledgement. This seems to be a different kind of good than following the law and being a good citizen, right? In a way that is recognized. And what's so tricky about all of this is it would seem as if we are going to talk about the possibility of a quote unquote belonging, or community that is not neurotic or authority-based, it has to somehow, and it'd be more Sithome, which I never pronounced that correctly, but alas, it has to be somehow able to navigate these distinctions. It has to be able to somehow work in the between space so it doesn't fall on the side of what I was calling meta-aesthetic, thinking an aesthetic of how everything is supposed to look, which then is a form of violence, thinking that it's defending beauty when actually it's fallen into a meta-aesthetic and it doesn't even realize it. And this would also suggest why it almost seems like the self-defense of philosophy or thinking is very necessary, because without that, you may slip into a meta-aesthetic or fall under an aesthetic violence but think it's beauty and not know it's not. And so then that's like Kierkegaard's total depravity, where you're depraved and don't know you're depraved. You're stuck and you don't know you're stuck, right? So there's this ability to identify the differences that is important. And yeah, to what you were saying, I mean, to me, in the same way that Hegel is very concerned about intuition, I just feel this is true, therefore it is true. Intuition without conceptual mediation seems quite bad. Likewise, an aesthetic where it's like, I don't need to think about it, it's just beautiful, or quote unquote, it's just attractive, when really it's just propaganda, that seems problematic. But here's the weird thing. So you need some sort of beauty that is conceptually mediated, like you're saying with kind of the mathematics and the rational, but then the very conceptual mediation of beauty seems to somehow be a threat to it. It seems to destroy the effect. It seems to destroy the capacity to actually be hit by something outside of a rational calculus. It's almost like you have to get really, really good at being philosophical, which is the very thing that makes it really, really difficult to be struck by beauty. But if you are not, then beauty can actually ultimately just be an aesthetic or a meta-aesthetic. I keep using those back and forth because I'm forcing you to deal with my new terms. And so that, in the same way that you're at danger of an intuition just pulling you along. Chetan, please.
Yeah, I'm just, the challenge becomes in that sense to think of beauty as a structure where it's not simply an interiority of the object, or it is something which is of a kind of an opening in which something can appear in that sense. What is at stake? Because we cannot exclude beauty as a criteria out. That is, of course, violent in itself. And we cannot simply take the aesthetic criteria as a given, which we know forms of power, especially in late capitalism, are doing. Both of them, in that sense, slip into certain kinds of ethical ambivalences, which are problem. Then what is at stake in our thinking about beauty? And Plato asked that question. I think the earliest philosopher who asked that problem was exactly Plato, where he was trying to think about this distinction between art in life and art as a separate, that okay, you do art separately, and then in life you become all rational and everything. And Plato was sort of arguing that this distinction doesn't work in that sense. How do we think through that challenge? I don't think we have really answered that question in any meaningful sense today.
I think that's actually a magnificent question. So this notion of how does beauty function structurally as a kind of opening for others without becoming a meta-aesthetic might be how I word it. Like, how do you have beauty? Because the moment you let in others, don't you have to convince them to follow that beauty? Doesn't that mean you're right there begging for propaganda? So how do you have beauty as an opening? Because if it's going to be a science of beauty, it can't be individualistic. Like, a science is something that is social, right? Like, anyone can enter the laboratory and experience, right? So this Plato idea of a rigorous study of beauty can't be merely based on an individual subject, right? It has to be social in some sense. But if it is social, it is begging to become a meta-aesthetic or propaganda. In the same way that a good that is social is begging to be used by power to manipulate people, and truth is being used, right? So what would it mean? And maybe this is where Plato and Socrates is using dialogue. There's something about the dialogue structure that seems to be an opening for beauty that doesn't fall into the meta-aesthetic, which would then speak to perhaps Zoom as the social coordination problem mechanism and infrastructure. But more must be said. Let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
This is really good. I'd like the new term that you said, Daniel. I think it positions things nicely. I guess I want to just preface before getting into that. I think a good way to approach this is to talk about the difference between participating in a discourse and then shaping the boundary conditions of discourse. So like, for example, I'm sure the conversation you and Michelle had about creating the net, what would that be like, is very different than us participating in the net. Like whatever I can never know what that was like. And that's kind of the mystery and the cool part. Like, just like when you see like a really good movie, you never really quite know like how they got there and allowed you to shape the experience. I think what's needed, it seems like, is there's a certain dart throwing. That's funny. There is a certain propaganda that seems to be inherent within the dimension of beauty. Actually, is what I want to say, because like, for example, when you're shaping like the boundary conditions of the net, like there is this certain, in this case, like there is a certain goal. Like, because there's a certain goal in mind, there has to be some form of presentation that like shapes the goal accordingly to that goal. And I think that's what propaganda really is. And I don't think all propaganda is bad in that sense. So like, I want to say that for there to be a society that's governed by beauty, there needs to be a meta-aesthetic. But the meta-aesthetic needs to be super dynamic. It's not fixed where it's like the Nazis have a meta-aesthetic that's fixed. It's like, for me, theme would be that propaganda that is that meta-aesthetic that does, in a certain sense, shape all the possible beautytific visions, but it's to a certain goal, which is beauty. But it's not, again, a fixed beauty. But there still needs to be a goal in mind. Like we're still like concrete, tangible things, goal-oriented, you know? I mean, I'm sure Aristotle wanted to get with a girl every now and then or whatever, you know? Like everybody has like a immediate goal that you can't ignore. I think with the concept of a society that's governed by beauty, I like what you're saying with the openness, where everybody has their own beautytific vision insofar as it allows other people to have their own beautytific vision that's different. So that means the meta-aesthetic needs to be this dynamic starting point that allows for all these different beautytific visions. And that, I feel like, can't be ignored. Otherwise, the beautytific visions will collapse and eventually it will become, like, the unfolding of this hypothetical society will eventually become some form of like Nazi, some form of synthesizing singular beauty. There needs to be like an awareness of the meta-aesthetic, of a dynamic meta-aesthetic. So it's like, I should be able to have a conversation with someone that's Catholic about this stuff. Like the fact that like one of my best friends, really smart, we both got our philosophy together, devout Catholic. Like, I know we're coming at it differently, but there's something beautiful about him allowing me to have my worldview and me allowing him to have his worldview, and us having a fruitful conversation despite that. Like, it's hard to put into terms, but the conversation itself it's like clarifying our own worldviews, and we're not negating our own worldviews. We're actually propping up each other's worldviews without collapsing into the other worldview. And it's something about that. It's like dancing around this paradox. Like, how is that possible? Like, if you agree with my friend Luke, if you agree with his perspective, why aren't you a Jesus lover and whatnot? there's just something about my own positionality, my historicity going into it, that clearly won't allow me to do that. I mean, it's not in my control, you know. There's a certain level of like, it's not in my control what ultimately I understand, like, and that alludes to what Jockin was telling me in the like last week or whatever in a conversation, which I think we have to lean into in order to have. It's like, yes, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, but there's still this aspect of it I don't understand. And like, if you really lean into like, the understanding really doesn't come from you, then it's quite easy to have this like meta aesthetic that is quite dynamic, because the meta aesthetic acknowledges that the propaganda that it is, the understanding of that comes from something beyond the propaganda itself, whatever you want to call it. So I kind of wanted to flirt with that. I have to think through that more, but this is very provocative. It's really, what you were saying, Chetan, was really good. So I just want to also say real quick. So like, I understand like in these biographies, there's like, and I can like somewhat relate where there's like there's this vision and you're trying to chase after it, and like in the chasing after it, you're doing good. Like that's the good. But, and I know it's like impossible in a certain sense, but nonetheless, to get that vision, there was still a context where a threshold was met. You did not acknowledge it, but you stumbled upon meeting that threshold in said context. So then, if that is true, well, like, we're back in good in a certain sense. If that is true, then how do you teach children to find inspiration? To me, that has to be done through good, but you're playing with good in a certain sense. It's like good acknowledging that, again, the understanding of such goodness doesn't come from the particular good that you're dealing with. Like, I want to make like a new word for that, because it seems like colloquially when you talk about a good, when you're like teaching and raising kids, it's always in relation to some particular like content. Like, it doesn't teach you how to train your mind, how to basically deconstruct content and reconstruct content, in other words, which to me sounds like the engineer. So I would want to ask like Jockin, like elaborate a little bit more on the difference between the engineer and the artist, because there does seem to be a certain level of like implicit engineering that's going on, like not explicit engineering. Like they're not aware that they're walking into the correct threshold where the vision's going to happen, but he has to pee. My dog has to pee. Of course, right when I'm like feel like I'm getting something, but there seems to be a certain level of engineering that is going on. So the question is, how do you train people to be implicit engineers? How to implicitly engineer, that way you can work as the artist in like scaffolding it out. And then you can be like, I want to say after that scaffolding out, there's a certain like a precision point where the engineer and the artist collide into one. And like, that is what I would say you're like a professional artist or a professional, like there's something about professionalism or like like being a professional. Yeah. That it's like you're taking engineering and you're taking the art and you're putting it into one. Like LeBron James, he is an artist in a certain sense, and he is an engineer in a certain sense, because he is I have to pause my thought. I'm still gonna be on the call listening. He's just really whining, and I can't think. I'm sorry, guys, but I hope that was
if Heidi pees on you, it will be a Beauty-That-Thematically vision on the camera. So worry not. Let me give it to Jockin win and say no. There's a bunch of things. I mean, there's definitely a sense in which you have to meet the you have to meet the threshold of being born, of being able to walk, of having eyes. There is a sense in which there are like you have to be good at the biological givens. Like there's something to be said where the parents, like if my parents did not, it's almost like you have to meet the threat. The initial threshold is more part of your determinations, maybe set by your parents. They allowed you to buy Red Wall so that they allowed you to be up till midnight so you could be in the bathtub in your blanket. Like, you had to meet those things. But it's interesting because those thresholds that are met, they are good. You had to get good at them, but they're much more tied to biology, the situation you're thrown in, which would actually say that a reason why having bad parents can be really problematic is because they don't create the conditions where some sort of inspiration can come forth, or something, maybe they were bent on shaping you in their own image and wouldn't allow you to read books or something. So there is something to be said about certain conditions have to be met in order for the inspiration to occur, or the beautiful. What's interesting is these seem to be different, though, than the kind of skill development or condition development that occurs after the inspiration. It's almost like the conditions tend to be more external. They tend to be more based on the determinations of the situation you're in. And because you have those things and are relating to those things, they then meet the condition of allowing, say, the beautiful to strike you. So, but then, of course, the question is, are those really goods because they were more done for you versus it's not like you yourself had a guiding principle of the good, right? There were goods of which were put around you or organized around you, of which allowed the beauty to come forth. But in your own individual situation, was your guiding starting principles of your will a vision of the good or something? Or maybe it was a vision of the good of your parents, of them put you in that situation so you could meet that threshold, which was then based on their own, say, perhaps vision of having children. Maybe this would get into some of those dynamics. So the point, it is interesting how you have this falling back on one another, which then would suggest why it is so easy to conflate these categories together. But there does seem to be distinctions on the process. And again, if we're talking of signs of beauty, keeping those things apart seems really important. And yeah, on this idea of a society of beauty or a science of beauty, it seems like right now the choices are a society based on, say, capital, which then compresses everyone according to the neoliberal order, and that seems to fall into the neurotic structure, or society based on justice, which a lot of people are pushing to increase justice, which doesn't sound bad, but the problem is that collapses the beautiful into the good, and then you end up having what looks like justice according to people's ideas of justice, and that can become its own oppression, right? And certainly there's going to be some sort of structure in meta-aesthetic, in the same way that in belonging again too, there's gonna be discourse and rhetoric. The problem is when beauty becomes merely aesthetic, when rhetoric becomes merely discourse, when everything is merely, when quality becomes merely quantity, that pesky merely, that seems to be something that things naturally fall back on because of the human brain, because of how we naturally tend to operate, save energy. There are other reasons for this. But the meta-aesthetic is going to be there. And then, of course, like you're saying, the question is, what are the shared social conditions of which would increase the probability that in of itself would have some sort of meta-aesthetic, like a set table or a certain room, because if it's too chaotic, it couldn't actually be something that people could be drawn into to participate in. So there has to be some aesthetic. But what would the aesthetic be to create spaces of opening that increases the probability for the average person or the majority to have experiences of beauty that can be the guiding principle of their communities and belonging, versus a neurotic or authority structure that leads to all sorts of pathologies? That gets for me into reforming the classroom away from the trivia structure according to something like a dialogo structure, removing the college monopoly on credentials. That makes me think on Joshua Hanson's book that he had a talk with Samuel Barnes and other things. But before that, let me pass it to Thomas Jockin, Mr. Wynn, and Mr. Barnes. So Mr. Jockin, please.
There's so many notes. I'm not going to bother to try to circle back to everything I wrote. I'll start. I think there might be some terms from Aristotle that might be useful here based on this discussion. So we'll start with, first of all, there's the idea of what's called energeia and kinesis. So they're both activity, but they're different distinctions about kinds of activities. So just to draw it out, kinesis is incomplete. So with the kind of consumptionary kind of activity where you're constantly consuming and it never completes, it has a kind of indefiniteness. Hey, Michelle. That's kinesis. So those would be the kind of, that'd be like that distinction. And Ageia is the complete act all in one. So the activity is an all in one encompassing versus an indefinite just running off forever and never gains satisfaction. I think that might be a useful distinction being talked about here. Another one is the chronos versus kairos distinction of time, right? So these kind of similar properties, right? So one is the striking, the kairos strike of the moment. So we're talking about the strike of beauty. That's the beauty of a strike that basically kind of like separates realities. Like kind of like the moments of just like, what? And everything slows down and like everything goes white or just dissipates around and you just see the thing in front of you. I think that'd be like a kairos kind of revelation. It's basically revelation, right? Chronos is like continuous duration flowing through time. I think another one is very kind of not talked very often in Aristotle's ethics is the prize and praise distinction. Prized things are different, or basically notice that we need some discussion about doing actions without being notified, a kind of recognition property. So the idea of prize and praise draws out that distinction, right? When something's praised, it has that kind of social recognition. I'd almost would say a thumos. Actually, by the way, I was actually surprised Daniel even bring that up. The kind of the thumos spirit kind of orientation of all, and kind of sitting in the background of all this. Prize is for its own sake. It's something that it is a possession of one own holding. But I'm just kind of spitballing this because there's a huge problem. And the problem is in the ethics, the martyr is brought up. The greatest possession, the greatest act a friend can do is to give one's life for his friend. Jesus quotes it. It's from Aristotle makes mentions about that same concept. That's an honest signal. So we have to say that to give one's life for the sake of another. It's a very honest signal. And it's said to be the greatest thing to be prized and praised. It's basically a combination of both. But that kind of bases the point of the kamikaze pilots, for example, or anything. All these orientations are about a kind of privational orientation. So basically the ideology gets justified by this destruction of the individuals inside. The ideology is reinforced. And this is a kind of orientation around a good. So I think these problems, I think it's a serious problem because it relates to recognition. I think maybe one of the drawing out points, just riffing off it, is that element of recognition, right? Is that ironically, when you do it for recognition, it transforms its significance to have this potential corruptional effect or transformation. And I think Clayton's question about the politics of beauty or economics of beauty, it's the same problem. How would you orient a society around these points that when the thumos quality is probably, one can argue that's probably our biggest problem culturally right now, is that we have those outbursts of emotionalism or thumos all over the place. And we cannot contain it. And it's just running amok and destroying basically things like justice, for example. I think also the Kantian discussion of beauty, it's a serious challenge. I think actually, Daniel, our conversation on our Twitter conversation actually ties into this point. It's that actually, while there may be a beauty of objects for itself, there is also the beauty of the subject with the object. It's an interpenetration. The inner is the outer is the inner. And it's kind of like almost like a vocal twist, like a ring that's been twisted inside and out and outside and in. That penetrative quality occurs. And I think actually a very important distinction is, beauty the way we're talking about it, definitely a quality about it is one does not just have the appearance and go, that's nice. And like, no, as Danny just said, there has to be a transformation. So it's not just, I feel a thing, I feel the beauty, therefore it's true. Like as if my presupposition, my viewpoints is just reinforced by it. It's actually quite the opposite, ironically. The beauty tends to strike you of how wrong you are and how much you need to be, you have to self-correct in the face of it, which leads to a path of demand, which is interesting, right? Because Daniel, the whole point about, one has to cultivate a training, usually, as we said, some kind of episteme, probably, to cultivate some understanding, to then give it up, as you say, to basically release it. Because that's the point. It's not really an episteme anymore. It's maybe a prudence or a Sophia, basically a wisdom at that point. So also that language of signs of beauty, you need to be very careful about that, because that language, we might be missing what we're talking about here. if we don't disassemble that knowledge has different elements within the Greeks: techne, episteme, sophia, and prudence. And nous itself, that's all another thing. Or anyways, there's another problem, by the way, and I wanted to double check it, because there's a difference between the goods like health and wealth, and those things are like basically that's that kinesis. They're good for a purpose. That's indefinite, right? Versus what's laudable. The other language is praiseworthy. And Aristotle makes a distinction of the two. They say the virtues are praiseworthy, but things like health, so like temperance and justice, are praiseworthy, but health is good. So that's where Aristotle is trying to draw out that there is a distinction again, but it's a little difficult here because I had to do more research on this on terms of how to associate the praiseworthy from Aristotle to the good, the agathos that he talks about. He's saying there is a clear distinction, and it probably does relate to the enegeia kinesis relationship. I see a similarity in that, and the prize and praise element as well. But it seems like these all are very easily captured by thumos or some attributes of that. So I'm kind of sitting here with a serious question about that. I only say that too because Andrew Luber's point about does the beautiful have a preset bait? Like, are we always going to be trapped in the good? The problem is, one can make the very simple proposition that existence is good is a baked in presupposition, no? Like that's kind of the operation, or that the truth is good, or the beautiful is good. Like that's a problem. I don't have an answer to it. Not yet. I don't have one yet. But I do think it's the only thing so on that part, I think Luber is very sincere and legitimate about that question. I think it is a serious point of, how convenient your argument of the beautiful is a non-ideology than everybody else is. Because we can point to Nazis and Japanese suicide killers. Oh, but your argumentation of the beautiful, especially when it comes to a politics of the beauty or economics of beauty, now all of a sudden when you do it, it's okay. Or it doesn't have the same kind of capture properties to it. Obviously, because the point is like you're letting it be arguments is cued until someone has to do something. Like when there has to be some actions. And Daniel, actually, I was reading Belonging again on the plane today. Your point about system and ideology, outstanding. The whole point is a system works even when the people don't believe it. Oh, so good. It's so good. It's basically the point. It's like gravity. It does not matter your opinion about gravity. You can think whatever you wish. It does not matter. Gravity is affecting you. Just like a system affects you regardless. I think that's an excellent point. So any kind of structure of politics or economics, which will be systems, almost what we're going to say here, saying not systems. That's your whole argument, Daniel, is that you have to scale. And when you scale, there needs to be systems. So how are we going to do this? It's a huge mess. The only thing I will say on this idea of the net being referenced. Now, let me put it this way. All these questions about like the praiseworthy and the good. I used to be cracking up over there, Daniel. You're having a grand time. I'm going to close with this. I didn't even know what was going in here. Like the project of the net, while it maybe had, I would say its intentions are very loose, incredibly loose. Yet it can generate these outcomes that are completely unpredicted, that are net positive, self-reinforcing, and people want to come back and do more. So I would say the net is definitely a pointing of some kind of operation of the beautiful. But that's my point. It's not necessarily aesthetic, now is it? At least not aesthetic in the normal sense of sensation. It's a kind of intellectual beauty. So the kind I think Jockin brought up about mathematics. It's a kind of, and that is true. At the best moments of the net, I get a strike of revelation. I'm like, oh, that's a good point. Or, oh, that's a good question. I need to start investigating that. I would say these are the best things I can offer to say we're playing with it. And I think the net is a kind of science, a little unspoken science experiment about that. But it's a completely notice though, it's completely contingent. There's some parts that are systematized, right? It's a certain time, certain place, but it's contingent on also individuals of a certain quality. So Daniel, you're actually almost proving your arguments by the net. Anyways, these are my points. I have more. I'm going to stop. I hope that was useful.
I enjoyed that very much, and you said a lot that was outstanding there. And yeah, definitely when you were taking on there's and I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, like the idea is the problem. the way we've learned to deal with global pluralism is by systems like capital or neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus or AI, and they work precisely because they don't need humans to negotiate how they work, which is their glory, but also their terror. They work even if you don't, want them to work, right? And so if you don't like that, because there are all these unintentional consequences, Mr. Barnes and the great Raymond Owen were having a conversation about the rat utopia experiment and how if all of this kind of systematically leads to a rat utopia in a like Kafka story, Little Fable, which is about mice, then if you say we don't want to go there, then you have to remove the system. But then that means you have to deal with global pluralism and vast diversity without a system, which means it would be on a human element, but it's really hard for humans to get along and relate, especially if they're diverse. So how in the world do you go about doing that? And then the problem is, like on this notion of themos, and Raymond, Owen has that book, Studies in Themos, and there's that wonderful part where he talks about how, it's actually thematic to go on the battlefield without armor. You say, well, isn't that irrational? Isn't that stupid? Well, no, it's actually considered more kind of masculine or warrior-like to not to be naked. That nakedness actually has more of a thematic quality, right? And there's something, then the question is the following. If you see a warrior on the battlefield who's not wearing armor and they are masterful, does the first word come to mind say, oh, they're a good fighter? Or is it more like, wow, they're magnificent? Which is funny because if there's an impulse to say they're magnificent, if they meet the conditions of being thematic as such, it's almost like you're saying they're beautiful. Which then, like when Nietzsche talks about his will to power, I think it's more like a will to beauty. A kind of beauty is what he's talking about is beyond good and evil, which is a kind of like dance, blazing star. And what's interesting there is this is the great problem because like Owen talks about, and then I know Peter Lindbergh, like the world today is very lacking in themos, right? And so there's a question of how do you get themos again, right? Which would bring with it social recognition. And without that, there are all sorts of pathologies that develop. Well, people are trying to base themos on, say, goodness, which is based on justice. If you're a just person, you will be socially recognized. And if you fight for justice, that is going to be thematic. Well, that leads to some of the problems we see, right, with wokeism and different things, right, where you're fighting you're basing the social recognition and the battle on justice, because whose justice, right? Well, what if you do it on truth? Well, that could lead to all of the oppressions of the priestly class, of the experts or the authority or the scientists, right? So fighting for truth and being socially recognized means you align with the scientific consensus. Well, that doesn't seem to be good. So this leaves us with some sort of thymos based on beauty. Some sort of thymos that is more like, because beauty you'd associate with the erotic, eros. That leaves us with logos, eros, and beauty. But of course, it would seem as if this strike moment we're describing of beauty is precisely some sort of harmonization of the eros, of the logos, and of the themos, because in that like recognition of beauty, you are then socially recognized as someone who can recognize beauty and participate in that beauty. So what would it look like to have a society of which is going to base themos on something more like beauty? Because beauty is important because it is beyond quantification. Therefore, it cannot so easily be captured in a Deleuzian sense. It can't fall in line with capital or neoliberal order. It cannot be systemized in light of, say, a transhumanistic AI project or different things. But the moment you talk about beauty, most people are going to take the signs of beauty according to a meta-aesthetic that makes them susceptible to propaganda. So we are talking about some sort of recognition of a strike, being recognized as someone of whom can recognize a strike, creating communities of which then experience those strikes, and it requires some sort of mixture of structure that is opening, that isn't so systemized that there's no human element, but enough of a system and order so that there's the possibility of a regularity so thymos can develop in social recognition. And indeed, thinking of the net, which also gets tied to the thinking of the diner, thinking of HUDs is kind of tied to these sort of questions, because you have to have something like that that creates an opening for something to come forth if people meet certain conditions. And the question becomes, how do you spread the probability of the average person meeting those conditions so that they can be recognized and thematically saturated, if you will, by something that is dealing with beauty. But before I say more, let me pass it to Wynn and then Mr. Barnes. Mr. Wynn, please.
Too much has been said on this fine evening. Too many nice ideas. I just wanted to, I feel like I've tried this twice on the net where I have come up with this idea where I'm trying to introduce Zizek into this because it's where I'm kind of still with my PhD. And I feel like I can do it, but it might get a bit too abstract, and then I'll stop talking, and then I'll just talk about letting be, because that seems to be the reoccurring theme. I think this problem of like the question of relative knowledge versus absolute knowledge, yeah? Like it came up before what I said about this idea that Heidegger would say that we're kind of always inframed in some sense, this is the early Heidegger, inframed in the historicity of history itself. We're framed according to relative interpretations that change throughout time and space. This brings up the question of how is it then that in the experience of life, what we call life, you can attain that experience, a same experience called beauty. Because aesthetics is trying to understand not so much how you attain it, but what it is, yeah? So I made some comments in the chat, which I got some comments from Heidegger saying modern aesthetics is the consideration of humanity's state of feeling in relation to the beautiful. That's how it developed kind of after Kant, which is what Clayton was pointing to. But then this involves problems because it assumes that we can, as subjects, attain an object called beauty through a knowledge of what it is, you know? And of course, everything that's being said today, is critiquing that very presupposition. Yeah, like that's the baseline presupposition here is like, if you go towards beauty through a good, through an idea of what's good to get to beauty, you'll always end up in a failure. And I want to just try and connect this to what Zizek calls distinction between the highest, like beauty, and the lowest, meaning the immediate place within which I seem to find myself thinking about beauty. And it's a quote which has nothing to do with beauty. It refers to what he would call the gap, not only between what I think is my subject position, trying to attain an accurate idea of beauty, but also the gap which for Zizek is inherent in beauty itself. Because that's what is for him the real. You'll never find the event of pure beauty. You'll find the event of a lack, or not even, because he talks about division, talks about antagonism, inconsistency. But for him, and this is the later part of his work, when you accept this, and this goes to what Jockin said, so this is when I tried to approach Zizek, is sacrifice. This idea of sacrifice for the current Zizek is really central to everything. Like it's only at that moment of a pure sacrifice where we even sacrifice the division between immediate subject position and object of the other, that we find the gap is in our own subjectivity itself. Because for him, ontologically, what is real is the gap in all things and of being itself. And even between being and non-being, there's a gap. And this is where he tries to bring us. So I might read something. Okay, maybe not, because again, it's a bit too... Okay, this is what lets Zizek claim, quote, the process of sublation, which is a key part of his reading of Hegel, is itself, that has also to be sublated. Meaning, we take the idea of beauty notionally, and this is where aesthetics starts, like, okay, what is beauty? But he says even that notional idea has to be sublated. Meaning you have to realize that what is beautiful for you is a good for you. And it's particular and relative according to your time, sustained by an exception, by the unique point, and this is the point for him, exception, what brings you perhaps to beauty is an exception, which is a short circuit between the highest, pure ideal self-determination, and the lowest, natural mediancy. In other words, the gap itself is never solved. It is simply filled in by the real of natural immediacy that is sustained for him by desire or drive. This is a drive of which the ended point of philosophy can be tied to subjective destitution and the affirmation of the emptying of the other, the emptying of beauty, and the emptying of the division between where you think you are and the beauty that you're trying to attain. And this again is where sacrifice comes in. This is why in relation to the drive, subjective destitution is that, quote, of a purely formal gesture of self-sacrifice grounded in no deeper meaning or goal, end quote. This is the point. This is where Zizek really gets to. He wants you to experience not simply like an ontological idea of a gap, but he wants you to experience what that means for sacrificing your notions of the very division. And I think this is then what connects it to releasement in some sense. And I wanted to read one final quote that I found. I don't think it's going to be, yeah. Actually, there you go. I found it. Here we are. This sacrifice, and is related to Hegel's concept of experience. This sacrifice is thus its own releasement into clearing. That's where I think this is my point in my PhD, is like there are contemporary figures who are talking about this moment of like reconciliation, but not through like reconciling the higher with the particular. It's reconciling with the fact that there will always be a gap there. And in waiting in that gap, experience itself changes. And that's the moment perhaps where the event of beauty can take place, you know? Yeah, and I think this is the only thing that really for me keeps repeating itself tonight is where do we find this event of beauty which breaks through the historicity of ideas? It breaks through my own particular perspective. Like the glimmer, like what is this glimmer? Like when do we glimpse this glimmer, you know? At what point? What are the conditions for the possibility of the event of glimmer? And I think it always has to be this movement of like undoing, sacrificing, waiting, silence. Like Derrida is like the trace is there when you kind of wait a bit, you know? Like you see the gaps between the words in some sense. Like you realize that your idea is never totalized. The book always contains within it, you know? And I think this is kind of post-Kantian philosophy. Like there's always these moments and traces of glimmers, traces, slight events, and then we try to rephrase that through the good. And I wanted to make one point for Andrew Luber, like came up in the conversation the other day, talking about the quality of knowledge or language or the net or a text or a play or an art piece. What can bring us to these moments where the beauty comes forth? I think conversations like this situate that question, because I think what this does, and this is what I said last time on the net, Daniel, you send out the emails and people arrive, they come, they listen, they talk, they spend time on Word documents searching for beauty and miss 10% of what's said, and then I regret missing 10% of what's said sometimes. But it's like I'm being let be to be here and to talk about this because I think everyone's concerned with that relation of like, in a way, truth. Like, how is it that we experience beauty? How is it that we experience being? What does it mean to sacrifice? What are we sacrificing? And what happens in that experience? You know? Again, this is why the other day with Jockin and Luber, I was thinking of being for Heidegger, like, because this is the point. How do we get to being? It's only when we annihilate. It's only when we let it be that something comes forth which says something about our being, our experience in that moment, you know. And just one final quote from Zizek, because he talks about the problem of cynical wisdom in postmodern thinking, where it just treats everything like a specter, and he says there's no more truth, everything's relative within the horizon of each discourse and stuff. Zizek says, the implicit logic here is that one cannot overcome cynical wisdom with some positive ethical ideal, which is the previous idea. Like, no, let's bring in like the positive good called beauty. Cynicism can undermine them all, saying, like, that's just a good, it's just relative, it's just particular. Then Zizek proposes, it is only a totally meaningless self-sacrificial act that undermines the cynical distance itself. The Freudian name for such an act is, of course, death drive, and its Hegelian name, self-relating negativity, both of which for Zizek are continuous moments of releasing. He wouldn't use this word. He does. He uses the word releasement 3 times in his work that I found. The first was in The Sublime Object of Ideology, where he talks about Gelassenheit, and he affirms it. The other times he critiques Heidegger's idea of Gelassenheit, of releasement. He said, like, it's too much to do with willing stuff. But in the beginning of the sublime object of ideology, he affirms, rather than calling it sacrifice, he would call it releasement. He would say, like, give yourself over to what we're calling the gap indeterminacy, and you'll experience the event of.
No, delightful. Thank you, Mr. Wynn. And yeah, if you give yourself over to the indeterminacy of having a puppy, then you give yourself over to the possibility of letting it release its bladder all over your leg. But I think Mr. Luber avoided that opportunity. I'll pass it to Mr. Barnes. No, there's lots of, well, and it's very interesting because, so there's a few things, that gap you were mentioning. Like, I think in Mr. Barnes' work in the Iconoclast, when he talks about how we'll never answer the meta question, and how there's an interesting way which the very impossibility of answering the meta question could be the very condition of the necessary for there to be a possibility of an encounter with beauty. And also what's very interesting is if you can never answer the meta question, which is kind of the ultimate question, the question of questions, you know, the meaning of life, you know, the grounding of philosophy, and Mr. Barnes, you know, I highly suggest that book, then actually that means truth can't be primary, the good can't be primary, but it has to be some sort of encounter with a limitation of the meta question that may actually be the opening of beauty. Maybe, maybe not, but there is an interesting way in which only a reality of gaps, which would be a reality of the possibility of nihilism, would be a reality of the possibility of beauty, which would break through in those gaps in this way as we are defining as distinct from a meta-aesthetic in different things. And then but then the gap cannot be systemized. This is what's weird. This is why there might be hope in it. And yet you can be systematic about the conditions of the gap. This is kind of the weird middle ground, like, because in Belonging Again too, we talk about communities based on negotiation, which tend to be very similar. People tend to have similar ideologies. So you don't need a system because we can just talk and negotiate because we're similar. Whereas if you're going to have a lot of diversity, you tend to need a system, which then can lead to the pathologies of capital, the Washington, et cetera, so forth, right? Well, how do you have some sort of middle ground between those so you don't end up either in a cheap delusionism that's nuts, or end up in a capturable neurotic where you don't have enough delusionism to avoid Nash equilibrium and different things like that, right? Well, you need some sort of creating of the conditions of gaps where people can encounter in relationship and situations the limits, say, of thought, the limits of what they can think, perhaps the limits of the meta crisis, the meta questions, precisely so they can have a quality of experience of which is possible because they work to develop a certain skill so that they could be in those spaces and have those encounters, and then it not lead to a certain hopelessness or a certain giving up, right? Because what I find very interesting is what's the difference between releasement and giving up? They sound similar, right? Giving up, releasing, but there seems to be a radical difference between releasing and giving up. Like if you give up, you're not releasing, and yet it seems like you are. Releasement seems to be a giving up of some sort of, you know, giving up of some preset notions, but not quitting. So releasement is not possible from a place of quitting, but it also is only possible from a certain humility, of which then you have to meet the conditions as a subject to being able to handle, which in of itself I do think speaks to some sort of thymotic possibility, but not easily. Because like Mr. Jockin said, it's one big mess. Well, that's precisely why it can be thymotic and fun, because it's a big mess and hard. And so there's something thymotic in that, there's something infinite in that, something potentially apathetic in that. But then the question is, how does one go about thinking about that in terms of the political economic relevance, which brings us to economics as having something to do with lack. But before going into all of that, let me pass it to Mr. Samuel Barnes. Mr. Samuel Barnes, it is good to see you, and I always look forward to the opportunity to hear from you. And I also look forward to your recent conversations. Mr. Barnes.
Hey guys, I haven't done one of these for a while, so this has been good. I missed quite a lot of it, so if I've missed anything, I'm sorry about that. But it's definitely reopened the aesthetics question for me. I haven't thought about that in a long time since I sort of read Scruton. I don't think really, not seriously anyway. So I don't know if this misses the point on anything, but I think my view on it might butt up against what I've heard so far, at least. So I'm not against the science of beauty, but I think that we have to ask ourselves, like, what does that mean in the zeitgeist where we are? Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to start peer reviewing pieces of art? Like, and like you can see what that's done for mainstream science, right? What's that going to do for mainstream aesthetics? God only knows, right? So, but yeah, I don't know. I think to reflect on, I think this is. I've been reading a lot of Schopenhauer recently. I've been thinking a lot about Schopenhauer. So I'm unfortunately going to fall prey to that recency bias on that one. But I think this differs from his view on music, at least, is kind of his in on aesthetics. But I would kind of, because I think I've definitely come to the view that his will is a really good way and a much less, I suppose, I don't, yeah, I guess the reason why Nietzsche's will, as in the will to power, is so fractured is because that, you know, anyone who's done their Nietzsche scholarship knows that book is incomplete and it's a collection of fragments that have very varying translations. So I do think Schopenhauer's view on will, as he puts it, is much more robust, and that specifically is the will to life. And I think as a result of that, and again, this differs from Schopenhauer from this point onwards, basically. But I do think that aesthetics is ultimately, by virtue of the fact that we're experiencing whatever aesthetics is as embodied subjects that have this will to life pushing us forward to life or death or propagation or whatever we end up doing. I do think it's inherently connected to violence and sex, but also to the intellect and to the divine and the eternal. It reflects the messiness of what it means to be human, and I think for this is the reason why you know, a car crash is like a tragedy, right? It's a very terrible, horrible thing. Anyone who's actually been in a car crash where you've been injured or seen someone get injured will know what I'm talking about. But there's a certain aesthetic beauty to such terrible and tragic things. This is why, you know, they can't stop making World War II films, for example. So I think, you know, lots of people maybe on some level know this, but I think unfortunately, you know, you have the aesthetic drive to go into depravity, which ends up with the, you know, postmodern stuff you'll see in modern art galleries around the world. And I'm not here to like decry modern art, because I think that's a really like boomer, basic conservative take to do, basically. But you do end up with like, you know, actually, like I would argue, ethically bad on all levels pieces of work for the world, which just well, they defecate on things that are divine and eternal. Essentially, you end up with pieces of art like Piss Christ, and upon reflection, really, because it is just, you know, our, you know, liberals like us showing off. I essentially, on reflection, think that the Charlie Hebdo drawings fall under that category as well, in a way. If we were to view it from the external viewpoint, we probably notice that. But unfortunately, you have the other side of that, which is, you know, some like to go towards twee nostalgia, and I think that Scruton falls for this, unfortunately, in a lot of places. You know, the pining for a time that never really existed. And this has its vulgar form on Twitter, where you have these massive accounts that get loads of followers by just posting like Greek statues and talking about their diets and stuff. You know, these are both castrations of what I would view as genuine aesthetic, which is in all the messiness of you know. I suppose it's kind of connected to human ethical questions in the same way that our drive and our will is as well. You know? So if for this reason, I think that beauty by virtue of the fact that we are fallen subjects as humans is incredibly disjointed in this way. And I think that my conclusion from that is that there is a messiness to it, and I think that for that reason you have to cling to what's particular. And I think that in our milieu we have a instinct to go towards some sort of egalitarianism or pluralist aesthetics. You know, I have to respect your aesthetical choices and you have to respect mine, or something like that. And I, you know, like every you know, unification church, that sounds great, right? But unfortunately, you end up with either a mess, which is what you have in, you know, the cities of the world, especially the ones in Europe for some reason. I don't know why they're particularly being targeted. Maybe because of they have a genuine particularist aesthetic to their architecture. But you end up with, you know, the financial districtization of entire cities where, you know, they just look like airports, the whole place, and they've got no character to them. And that's what comes from respect and pluralism, basically, to be honest with you. Or it's a race to the bottom where you just allow the mob to take control of the means of aesthetic production, and you end up with, like we're like TikToks and Instagram reels of Peaky Blinders, and that's what the majority of people. That's the majority of people's aesthetic experience, and is like sped up and slowed down songs that get famous on TikTok, and that's essentially it. So I don't know. I honestly do think that sort of tolerance, unfortunately, from what we can observe, like melts anything of assertive aesthetic worth, which has, interestingly goes back to that dualism I'm talking about, because there's a certain I suppose I would there's a certain fascism to what I'm talking about here. Basically, there is a certain fascism to it, to say, no, this is like a people's aesthetic, or this is a correct aesthetic, or something like this. But like, I don't know. It comes back to the beautiful car crash, right? Like, you have to be plugged in, or an ideologue, to look at the architectural works of fascism to think like, oh, there's no aesthetic quality to these, or look at like the works of like Leni Riefenstahl, for example, say there's no aesthetic quality to this. I don't know. I just think that would be disingenuous. Yeah, and so this is a thread I sort of just pulled on here. But I do think that those impulses, lead to all things that set. I've talked about architecture, but also, like advertising and clothing and films. They all have this muddy attempt at edginess, and they're all muted, cool colors, and there's no spark anymore. That same spark which leads to Michelangelo also leads to Albert Speer, I think. And that's just like getting away from aesthetics, just like the difficult questions that come to us as human subjects. I think aesthetics bumps up against the same issues by virtue of the fact that we experience it through the same substrate. So yeah, I less of a statement there, but some things to think about, at least after what I've heard so far.
No, I think it's wonderful, and thank you for being here, Mr. Barnes. It's always a pleasure. I think what you're getting at on the need to think beauty, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber with the sex, the violent. I think it's a big point you're making, because a way I think about it is, you mentioned Mr. Scruton. Generally speaking, conservative thinkers like Scruton, and one I really like is a man named Hans Ruckmacher, who was brilliant on modern art. He was extraordinary. Scruton is correct that losing beauty is a big problem. But the conservative tends to be less likely to bring in the quote unquote real, to use that Lacanian sense, to be talking about the sex and the violent. And the more liberal thinker is like, you can't look away from the sex and the violent, right? But then they sometimes throw out the beautiful, so they don't have a kind of a binding structure, if you will, or an orbiting principle for the sex and the violence. And then you just actually get a kind of glorification of perhaps sex for sex sakes, right? Like, there are absolutely, sex can be in a movie and actually be part of the unveiling of the theme, right? You don't want to bring in moralization to get in the way of the possibility of beauty coming forth, but you then have to think that messiness, right? And what we're in now is actually, the issue is that the classical conservative efforts to recover the beautiful, although in my opinion correct in their intuition, has to go through a kind of work that gets into the bloody. Like when you read some of the myths, I'm thinking of some of the kind of the myths of the classics of, different things. They're quite violent. They're quite bloody. It's like, people, oh yes, the Iliad. Everyone should read the Iliad. Have you read the Iliad? For frick's sake. Oh my gosh, it's a bloodbath, right? And yet, there is something about that speaks to a certain literature. And I think this also, to the point, gets on why beauty as a social, as having a certain social value, requires thymos, and taking thymos seriously, which is the battle, which is the difficult, and then taking seriously the passions of eros. If you don't do those things, then whatever notion of beauty you arrive at, like a term I was using earlier in the conversation, ends up being just a meta-aesthetic an aesthetic, like a meta narrative that Lyotard deconstructed. By meta aesthetic, what I mean by that is a theory of how things are supposed to look, right? Well, that just tends to be in line with the capitalist order. A town is supposed to look like a place that has a McDonald's here and a Walmart here. And it's supposed to look like a place where guys are going to work at this. And as a male, you're supposed to look like X, Y, and Z. And this is the meta aesthetic that becomes very oppressive and is actually used by the power to control people. So you need to bring in the kind of thymos and the violence and the real to kind of shatter the meta aesthetic. But if you do that, are you ready to somehow figure out to direct the violent toward the beautiful? And by science of beauty, we were also thinking Plato, you know, Jockin was bringing up with Plato and Socrates this kind of idea of a kind of the need of a kind of science of beauty, which we can also associate with the German word that means science, like rigorous study of. Because I did giggle when you talked about a peer review of like the Mona Lisa. That's grand. Oh my gosh. So this kind of rigorous study. And then what are the conditions of the strike of beauty? Which again, like, is there something, there's a kind of violence in philosophy. Everyone talks about the violence of language, right? There's a violence of ideas that are part of it. There's a certain sort of ideas have sex, as Matt Ridley talks about, right? There are kind of principles of dialogue and this that have more of those kind of things that come together to make strikes emerge that otherwise would not occur. So definitely, I think basically, like you and Owen have spoken about on thymos and all of these things, like without thinking the thematic or the real, the sex, the violent, which I definitely think Schopenhauer's will is a powerful construct to consider these things. And I like Schopenhauer. Then this is going to make beauty not be able to provide a basis for a belonging again that actually is not too one-sided. So I appreciate your point, and there's more to say, but let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
I think what Samuel said, where how would you basically like the peer review of the artwork? I think that's a really interesting point. I think, well, first, just the part of the challenge is to make sex, for example, thematic in a story, very difficult. Like not most sex scenes you can cut. You don't need it. Stupid. But yeah, I mean, I think part of I'm losing my thought. But I would say something about the beauty, judging the beauty is something about judging the way in which the artist did the artwork, and not so much the content itself. I'm not really, I would have to flesh that out, but to understand how they do the artwork would help understand the particular content in a way that you wouldn't be able to understand if you come at it from the content itself and then you postulate where the artist is coming from. I would definitely have more to say on that, but yeah.
I mean, I think he makes sex in a movie thematic by just hanging a sign over the bed that says this is thematic. Isn't that what you do? I mean, it's how you make things beautiful. You just hang a sign over that says this is beautiful and it all works out, right? Right? But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. I think that point you just said about the making, there is something about beauty that is not merely the content. Like, again, to Owen's work on the idea of the warrior who doesn't wear armor having a certain thymatic beauty to it, because it does seem as if beauty, there are different ways it's located in this register or it comes together. It's like, it's not merely that the warrior wins the battle, but the way that they go about winning the battle, right? That they are doing it magnificently. That brings with it a certain disclosure of a higher way of being or something more beautiful that requires the fighter to fight in certain ways that otherwise would not have that disclosure. But let me pass it.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Samuel's point though, on a peer review of the Mona Lisa, we do have that. It's the crit. So the art world, we do have that now. So it's obviously the point of the challenge about that is everyone's first assumption is that how could you do that? It would seem like it would crush the art and deaden it. I think, and I brought this up before in art education, is that most of the time people are very bad at critique because they don't realize their response to the work is more a sign about themselves and their comportment to the work than anything about the work itself. A good critique, ideally, you would that's identified and you harmonize it. So what you do is you kind of work through identifying the first responses, the resonance of the individuals, observing the piece. First, we look to see if there's any populational similarity. So if multiple people gain the same resonance, that tells us something's occurring here. And then a good dialogue lead or a critique lead would then take that and then use dialectic methods to draw out distinctions, nuances, or revelations that might come out through the interplay of a dialogue with the work. Obviously, I know that's not what Sam. I mean, I know in the normal sense of peer review, it's the exact opposite of that. It's like, I've been peer reviewed, so I know what it is. Some random person you don't know gets an article, has no context of what's going on, and then gives a bunch of feedback that's somewhat related, but not really. I mean, it's been very rare I've gotten every peer review that's been like super systematic on particular content. It's like form stuff they have specific issues with in a very odd way. And those are writing papers, not. But when Sam leads in that sense, yeah, that doesn't really work. What I'm bringing up in the critique form is the critique format, which does require a grouping kind of a grouping dynamic with the art. But I also think Samuel, you're making great points. Again, the idea of the deadening of as Daniel also pointed out, is that the conservative critique of modernism and the postmodern period in the arts was that something was flattened out. In the act of modernism, and even in the reactionary stance of postmodernism, something was stripped out by the project of modernism that destroyed beauty in the sense of what existed prior. Now, a direct one-to-one copying, a mimetic kind of a LARPing, basically. A LARPing is Tom's good to see you. A LARPing is basically not the answer, but at the same time, like that tension about what was lost is what we're trying to draw out. Something about the beautiful was lost in these pieces. But I can point to plenty of examples actually in modern art that did achieve it. So like almost seems to be unanimous opinion of something special about Art Nouveau, which is really interesting because what that is, it's actually a reintegration of natural, basically curved shapes and nature patterns, for example. So kind of a biophilia that's not a kind of reductionist triangulation of shapes. So I just want to point out that like we have in a history of even relatively modern art of some cases where we think buildings and statues and design is beautiful, even in the modern era, but it tends to have some, what is the main distinction is that modernism obliterated the nature patterns and just wanted raw geometry as the logic. And that's actually been always the problem. Is that when you have a autonomous rationality in the form of geometric composition with no grounding in nature's fractal patterns and curved space dimensions, you destroy human relationships to it. We cannot purport to it in a way that works for us. A lot of argument was made that's just based on biological just permanence of time. I stand a little stronger on that point, but nevertheless, the point is human beings cannot resonate well in a geometric cube. It doesn't work for human beings. So that's what the conservative critique of modernism, postmodernism was about. I think Samuel's points are very good about that. One last thing is, by the way, his critique on basically the ones that are going to break the note of breaking away from egalitarianism, kind of averaging. So that brought me to my note in the very beginning about the problem with the general science of science of beauty which we try to take a very complicated object like the beautiful, which obviously then, because it's an analogical object, it has such diversity in the particular application. You try to flatten that down by an average, you just created you created a virtual object. Like, it's not reality. So whoopsie, you've cooked yourself before you even got started. Good to see you. I think the other note I bring up on that egalitarian side is, I remember from I think it was Gorgias, the Gorgias dialogue, where, oh, got the name. He was a very young person, a young character, and he's basically saying, enough with this philosophy. Good to have a little bit, but not too much. And he says along the lines like, a great noble soul will break through these chains and charms of the many, who chain down the greatness with a many with shining bright justice, will emanate the law of nature. I'm just saying, this is that kind of thematic energy. Yes, there you go. Daniel's got it. So these points exist. And I say that because also, Plato's had an acknowledgement about that with that character, but also just the whole point of Eros. Symposium has a lot of sections about that, but also Phaedrus. The whole idea of the Eros of love bubbles the soul. The soul is bubbling, and it's actually kind of a pain energy about it. So it's certainly not pleasure. Like, that's kind of the key. I think there's been some association there that the beautiful is always pleasurable. And I have to be honest, I've been always against Kant because he did this move where he separated all from beauty to somehow give that justification. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Because the original context, when Aristotle brought that up, I noticed that I know where Kant got it from. It's from Aristotle. He made that point in Poetics. But the point is, he said that was relative to man's understanding of beauty. Like, that was within us, opposition of it, not the beauty as a subject itself. That when something's too large in scale, we cannot comprehend it. That's true. But that doesn't mean about beauty as a general point. Anyways, these are all great points and great challenges, and I have lots to think about for this talk. Thank you.
Magnificent. I appreciate that very much. And I think that kind of that idea as well on the curvature, the kind of attraction on different things. You don't feel like the average like office worker in their cubicle is inspired and feels socially recognized? What are you talking about? I feel so natural. I feel like I'm in a forest if I get in a cubicle or different things like that. I think that alignment, well, what's very interesting is there's a certain kind of notion of beauty having something to do with a kind of alignment. Like, being in this geometrical cube is not fitting, or it's unnatural, right? Now, of course, you're on the verge of certain dangers then, because who decides what's natural and who decides what's found in nature, right? But what's interesting is, although the political questions come rushing in, there's an argument to be made that those sentiments they're what individuals feel. They're from a base ground sentimental feeling of something is off. And like something is off. And that makes me think of, in the same way that Socrates is kind of like philosophy starts in wonder. You don't need to have some totalitarian dictator that says, wonder, go. You just have a wonder experience and you go from there. Likewise, there's something where people go, this is off, which then maybe makes them vulnerable to manipulation. That becomes the kind of movement of searching, which again, when we talk about this strike of beauty, there's something that then it's the initiation of a beginning. Like when Dante sees Beatrice in the Viva Novitia before the Commedia, it's the beginning of the Commedia before he knows it's the Commedia. It's the beginning of something. The moment you're at the cubicle and you're like, this is off, it's the beginning of something, or you could repress it. And that leads to all sorts of trouble, right? So it's almost like once the happens, this is off, or this is beautiful, or this is not right, this is an injustice. There seems to be like, you see an injustice, what now? Or this is evil, what's now, right? There are these various kind of hits that occur, which then, because of these weird hits that feel to rush over you, it seems easy to conflate categories. But without getting too much into that, and then I'll give it to Luber here before bringing it to a close. So worry not, Chetan, we're not going to make it to the sunrise. We have to finish planting things in our garden before it gets too late, and it's too late. Is that there's these hits that then you have to reply to, or respond to, or address, or you repress. And if you repress them, that might be okay if there's a system that doesn't feel like it oppresses you, or if there's a community you can go to deal with things. But then again, that's only going to work if the community feels like it somehow addresses those repressions. So if you're like, yeah, I'm stuck in a cubicle 9 to 5, but there's a community, but there's a family, but I have kids, but there's ways to support a family, so on and so forth, well, then you might be able to deal with that repression. But if you're in 2024 and owning a home is really expensive, and the dating market is insane and politics is insane, then the repression of the cubicle may turn into a not addressed at all, and then it explodes, right? So then it would seem like the other road is to follow the feeling, in a sense. I feel like this is unnatural. Why? I had an experience of wonder. Let me follow it. So instead of repressing and having then a kind of social negotiation with those repressions so they don't blow over into social unrest, well, if the social contract is off, like Cadell talks about, or the neoliberal order feels like it's destroying the middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or that college is a share, whatever, then in order for people to not feel repressed to the point that it leads to social unrest, they have to follow that feeling. And they have to then have people as exemplars that can help them know how to follow that feeling, or where to go with it, or to not confuse it with a mission to say stop all the evil people, which can happen in mob mentalities, or to not fall into a meta-aesthetic that leads to propaganda, right? And that knowing where to go without going into it yet is actually a role that religions had that is not always appreciated. Like you said, I had this feeling that the world is off. The priest is like, yeah, because it's fallen. I had this experience of wonder. Yeah, that's called God. Let me help you figure that one out. Like moving you along. And Jockin, good luck at your presentation tomorrow. I have no doubt you're going to blow it out the water. And I'll have to run in a moment myself. Religions provided hey, you had this feeling. There's a term that some theologians have used of the sacred romance. Chitan was mentioning math. So you have this feeling that math is beautiful. And in some theological traditions, the notion is yes. So math was used let me just speak from a Christian context. So God used math to introduce you to the existence of beauty. But you must never confuse the beauty with the math. The beauty is something excessive of the math that is experienced through the math, but is not reducible to the math. And if you reduce it to the math, then what God was using as beauty to carry you along toward the actual beauty of himself is then idolatry. So you could say idolatry is when you confuse things that God used as experiences of beauty as the beauty. Now you're in idolatry, right? So I'll just use the beauty language. So you experience math, then you know beauty exists, and you're saying, I want more beauty because I know it is possible. Well, then as you go into your relationships or you go into your career, that becomes a guiding principle of what you are looking for. Just like if you had an experience of theme through math. It would be a mistake to say that the theme is the math, but the math was needed to be the grounds of the story or the sufficient goodness so that you could have the experience of theme, right? But you have to follow it up the chain of being, following up the ladder. But you see, here's the funny way. There's risk the entire way, because everything you experience as beautiful that's wooing you, it's like God is in a way wooing you for higher forms of subjectivity and character and sufficient goodness and good thresholds to be capable of more beauty. All along the way, things are being used that you could one day confuse as the beautiful versus merely a means to the beautiful. And now you're in idolatry. And actually, the further along you go in that development, if you ever commit the idolatry, the greater the consequences. Lucifer becomes Satan, right? And so there's this way in which what this means, and I think this model of the sacred romance, I'll call it the sacred romance, this is basically the grounds of Sithome belonging today. And communities where people can be introduced to a glimmer of beauty, but then given the guidance to develop that beauty towards something beyond the object of which they encountered beauty in, because the moment they encounter beauty, they are now vulnerable to confusing the thing with the beauty, and they actually need communities to help them not make that mistake. Likewise, to not be captured by a political campaign where you experience beauty in math or beauty in literature or beauty in Dante or whatever, you're now susceptible actually to being captured by a political campaign, maybe conservatism, that says we're defending beauty. And you end up just doing whatever they say because you believe in beauty, and they just actually use that to make you a part of the totalitarian movement, right? So you would have communities that would help you not fall into that trickery, not fall into that. But this is the weird part. what would those communities promise you then? Nothing. Because the moment they promise you something, it's not negative pragmatism. We can't promise you anything. All we can do is promise that you won't fall into a reductionism or a compression or a positive use value that then makes you capturable. Well, why should I be part of your community then? Well, because we know you had an experience of the sacred romance and we had it as well. We can relate to it and we can help create the conditions where you can experience it in your own particular ways, not in a kind of macro way that's oppressed upon you, and make you more skillful at those experiences in whatever particular domain you go into. That's why you should be part of it. Can you promise me that? No. No, we can't. So you have to make the absolute choice. So this is the key. There is a structure there, but it is not a system. It is a structure that you have to choose because it can't promise you anything. You have to sacrifice yourself and submit yourself to it because sacrifice seems to be a big part of this, as was mentioned. But it's an organization that can promise you nothing, but there's enough of a structure there so that you can choose a structure that can promise you nothing. And this becomes a Sithone basis of belonging, of which is one that is aware of the sacred romance and is helping you guide according to the sacred romance so that you can be ever surprised by that beauty or being of theme that you get better and better at being surprised by because you are in those communities that are aware of it, can help condition you according to it, of which you have reason to believe that community can do because you look at the members who are part of it who seem to be able to do it. And if they're able to do it, there's reason to think that if I were to be part of those relationships, I could do it as well. But there are no promises and there are no guarantees. There's only the pure relation, as Julie Resch was saying with Javier. There's only the relating, and then let be what is, right? But the reason, here's the key, the reason why, therefore, and then I'll give it to you, Mr. Luber, the reason why you would have reason to think that if you let be, something would occur, which is the point that Jockin is bringing up with Heidegger. The reason you would have reason to think that is because you've experienced the sacred romance. You've had a thematic moment in your life. You know that there's something in the very sinews of reality itself, of which has this ability of disclosing something suddenly and all at once that is there, and then you cannot forget it, and then it puts a call upon your life on the question of what you will do. So you know this is something that exists in the very fabric of reality, and knowing that this exists, there is then reason to think that if you let be, you meet the conditions of the sufficient goodness so that you can let, that something could occur. You know it is possible, but it cannot be promised. And you know that there are certain communities that increase the probability of that occurring precisely because they don't promise it, but you see the conditions of that possibility. And so you then make the absolute choice to commit to it. And you can't think the beautiful. You can't think the thing you're looking for into being, because that would then turn it into a meta-aesthetic or something of a use value. But you can choose to perpetually put yourself in the situation of the possibility of that disclosure. And that would be the leap. That would be the absolute choice. And that would be the choice to continue to put yourself where you can submit those things. And that, I think, starts to get at what a community today has to look like. To be kind of a Sithone based. And you asked on the question of, Michelle and I talking about the net and different things before I give it to you. It's basically the idea of how do you create a place where people of certain conditions who have a sense of the something more, who have a sense of the beauty and the good, would regularly meet, because if they don't regularly meet, you can't have this encounter occur, of which there would not be a topic, because if there was a topic, there would be a surprise. But the very fact that these certain people of this certain conditionality are occurring who are able to do something like the hip-hop cipher, because they meet certain conditions, they are thus capable of a cipher. And thus, if they regularly meet at a condition at a regular time, they would be able to work off of one another, to then condition off one another to get better at working off one another, to then be the kind of subjects that when they leave the net, they would experience reality in a different way. Then they would actually experience reality in a different way so that when they come back, they would probably bring with it different things. And then slowly and gradually introduce new people as relations become stronger and people are able to handle newness of more people that can meet those certain conditions. And what that does is create a balance between structure and surprise that creates a clearing in which the beautiful is possible. And in making that clearing possible, we will see if we are able to arrive at something that looks like a system belonging, of which would be replicating, say, what Randall Collins describes of the organizations like the Vienna Circle or the Bloomsburg or the Diner at HUD's, because you have a regularity of something that is not guaranteed, but you have the kind of people there of whom don't need guarantees because they have done the work to not need guarantees. And so if you bring those people together, the probability of theme or beauty being disclosed is higher because they have done the work to not, they've reached the threshold of being sufficiently good at not needing guarantees, thus a kind of negative pragmatism, of which then increases the probability of a beauty coming forth, of which then when people glimmer, that then becomes a justification for the communal formation and increases the desire to continually formulate around it, and you are what you love. As you come to love something, you become more like it. Thus, the community forms the subject, and as they are formulated when they return to the community, it's able to achieve higher in different themes and different forms of beauty, and then subjects leave and they change, and you get a feedback loop between people coming into the cipher and leaving the cipher, who then are then motivated to then do more work, to meet different thresholds of a sufficient degree, that then makes them even better at letting, so that they return, then you have even better letting, so you get higher probabilities of the experience of the beautiful, of which increases the reason to think that beauty can be the basis of a community, and therefore the basis of a society that is not based on a neurotic structure, but a system structure, and therefore is able to move to an economy of lack versus scarcity, a politics of story versus positions, and a process versus a mere duality. And spaces like this are hopefully working to show all of that. But let me give it to you, Mr. Luber.
Kind of the net should kind of like end with that. I feel like that was just a great closing. But what you're saying is just so good. I just have to. I'm sorry. Give me like just a minute or so. But basically, in what I'm reading with Heidegger right now, he makes a funny move where he has this juxtaposition of system freedom. He then says, okay, let's say it's not really system, but it's necessity freedom. And it seems that relation seems to be a necessity. So when you say it's not a system or a structure, that's the only thing that I was like, it seems very systematic. So I would want to understand more on that. And then just you said so much, just the other things that you said. I feel like in this conversation, it really hit me the difference between theme and beauty. And I don't think theme should be collapsed into beauty. And I would definitely was collapsing it into beauty. And that's because basically you create a space where the value is about something that's the value that's placed in the space has a significance towards something that is beyond the space, that you're saying it's just like a sense of more than. And I think you could just say in like Heideggerian terms, like Dasein, having a certain tune with Dasein makes you just immediately have a sense of more than. So I think that's like just thinking. If you're just a thinking subject, you just immediately get, oh, well, if I deconstruct this current thought, I immediately get more than that current thought. So there's something that's like very at the core of human nature. It's like you're just really playing at like these chords, so to speak, that are at the heart of human nature, it seems like. And which is so it's like you're playing with something that seems like, to me, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say, but like a system where it's really getting at freedom and necessity insofar as it puts you in the position to encounter the beautiful in the most likely chance. So if that system exists, then it's like, okay, well, there's like a science of beauty. there seems to be a science of beauty. But on the other hand, what you were saying made me think, if science is a study of objects, if it's a study of objects, can science be the study of a partial object? Because beauty is the partial object. So like before the beatific vision, before the strike, the partial object is still existing. It like you are getting to the place in which you meet that threshold and then the beauty strikes. So in a certain sense, that beauty was always within you leading up to it. So it seems like it's hard to put that in a vacuum then. And like science has to put the object, it has to be an object. So it has to be a full object. So in a certain sense, the perception of that object needs to be fully in a vacuum. And it seems like it can't be. So there's the system, the necessity thing where I'm saying, oh, there is a science of beauty, but then there's this other thing that's also suggesting that you can't have a science of beauty. I just want to finish with, if there is a science of beauty, it seems like it has to do something with God or something with theology. If there is a science of beauty, to me, it almost is suggesting that you're saying we can make God transparent, which seems very scary and very something not right about that, about the concept of God, like where we finite things can't impose upon something infinite to make it that infinite more transparent to us finite beings. Seems like that the power dynamic can't be that. But maybe that's just like a knee-jerk thought. So like, I don't know, there's the consequence to it. I was curious what you think about how that relates to God and theology. But I know you gotta go. So
those are so
for another
great.
time.
Well, a few things. First, when I talk about system, I have a kind of more particular meaning based in belonging again, which a system is something that works without a human element. It's like a machine. You set it and forget it. Like you don't need to like capitalism for capitalism to work for you, right? Negotiation-based communities are ones that only work if the participants learn to get along. Like there's going to be a bottle of water at the gas station up the street, rather you get along with your neighbor or not. That's the beauty of capitalism. That's also the problem of capitalism. A negotiation-based community is where I speak with my neighbor and agree that on Wednesdays, he'll put the water at the gas station, and on Thursdays, I'll do it. So we create our own emergent rules and laws, and the entire community is negotiation-based versus system-based. So to say that beauty is not a system means there's always a human element. There's always a human contingency. But here's the problem. If you have too much of a human contingency, you end up in what I call the cheap to lose, where sure, but it's just anarchism. Like, yeah, you don't get captured, sure, but there's no technological society. There certainly is not going to be a Zoom because no one's going to do the work to create the infrastructure regularly of the internet. And so anarchism and technological society struggle. And yet, we need something like anarchism to avoid capture. Well, this is where we talked about the dance, the sithome, and all of these different things, which seemingly the Zoom and the net make possible. So, on the question of a science of beauty, and this kind of notion of can you have a science of the hip hop cipher? Let's think that. Is it possible to create a cipher of hip hop, a science of hip hop? Kind of, depends on what you mean. You can have an art of cipher, and science is a rigorous study of. Or, this is where we were saying, or it means interchangeability. A science is someone that is not contingent on a human element. Is it possible that any given person on planet Earth could actually join a hip-hop cipher if they met the conditions? If you say yes, then something like a science of hip-hop is actually possible. If you say no, meaning that some people are born with capacities that other people do not have, and no matter how hard you try, there are simply some people that will not be able to do a hip-hop cipher. Well, this would suggest a science, for me, this would suggest a cipher of the hip-hop, a science of, wow, science and cipher keep mixing in my mind. That's funny. A science of hip-hop would not be possible, only an art or maybe a rigorous study, right? So when we talk about a science of beauty, because it does seem something like hip hop might have some sort of innate capacities that are part of it, right? Like there might be some innate capacities that some people have that make them able to do a hip hop cipher versus others. But what's interesting is the cipher as a model of community, which, you know, going with Bernard Hankins, and we talked about this with Leibniz, the cipher is to me the central model of a community today. That is symptom-based versus neurotic-based. That is emergent artistic-based versus authority-based, right? And so, like that, so we can look at this as being like a hip-hop cipher, but not quite the same. It's on the same gradient, though. You can look at all the circling, all the dialogos, philosophical discussion. You're in a circle, you're talking. There's something cipher-like about that, even if there's not rap, right? There's a certain model of a flow of interaction that seems to create a binding principle without having an authority. The authority is the skill, but that's not the same as like power authority, right? It's an emergent authority that comes from who's the best, right? Or who able is to point to the truth, right? Well, if a science of the hip hop is not possible, if you will, just a kind of study of the art, this is why the question of if everything can be beautiful is a really big deal. Like, if everything can be beautiful, then although a science of a particular beautiful object is probably not possible, a science of beauty might be possible, because something being beautiful to some given person is perhaps possible, even if the object of beauty is not interchangeable. Let me say that again. If everything on planet Earth can be beautiful under the right conditions, then interchangeability is possible, because everyone could find the particular thing that they, in their particular conditions, find beautiful. If you are able to determine what conditions or process a given person has to go through so that their particular thing that would unveil beauty to them, in fact, unveils beauty to them. Let me actually pause.
Yeah, no, that really makes that really. I mean, it's just, I've been thinking about it, as you know, with like if the entire world was like thematic, like it would just change the meaning of theme, and
yes,
have to,
exactly.
like
that's exactly right, and it would,
just...
and this would change the meaning of beauty from, like we were saying, meta-aesthetic. So if everything can be beautiful, which also is why the question of the three infinites is big. If you say everything could be good, everything could potentially be good, everything could be potentially be true, and everything could be potentially beautiful, then a science regarding these things is possible because of the everything. And the reason you may need a science, though, is precisely because of the risk of arbitrariness now. If everything can be beautiful, then what does beauty mean? That seems like an arbitrary meaning, right? It seems arbitrary. Well, that's why you need the study. The study would be figuring out the process that people go through to keep something that could define everything from being arbitrary in that possibility of possibly defining everything. Then you would need a science to determine how to figure out how to keep that. Andrew, please.
Okay, so this is where the distinction between theme and beauty is perfect, because I think the science would be theme, and wouldn't be beauty. Like, I don't even think beauty would be the right word, because beauty is just basically pushing the horizon every time. Like, that's what beauty is. It's not something that can be science.
This is the tricky, not to interrupt you.
I really see it. Yeah, no, please.
What you're saying, so this is the tricky little dimension between beauty and theme that makes them practically always come together, but technically distinct. Okay, so there's a practical togetherness, but a technical distinction. A way to think of this: beauty, when you encounter beauty, it always is a command. You know how you talk about the theme being a command? It's like the Rilke poem.
Yeah.
You must change your life. This is the key. Beauty is out of which the command comes, but is not reducible to the command. So the theme comes out of the beauty, which is only possible because of the beauty, and in a sense is the beautiful, but it is also distinct from it. So they're practically always together, but they're technically distinct. Again, the metaphor I always like to use is the Christian Trinity, which is the idea that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we lost them. We lost them. I'll keep talking. You know, the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost are practically the same, even if they are technically not. So beauty is technically distinct from the command beauty puts on your life, but if you encounter beauty, it always puts a command on your life. So this is where beauty and theme are distinct, even if there's a way in which theme and beauty are isomorphic. And I completely agree, Chetan, that the science of a thing is tied to the object in question. You can't separate those things. I completely agree with that. And so when we talk about the science of beauty, it's going to be very distinct from the science of a paperclip or the science of physics or different things. And, you know, what I was going to say before we lost our beloved Andrew Luber, because he was asking on this question of, you know, is it all God? Does it all lead to God? Like, it's the question of theology, which, funny enough, was called the queen of the sciences, right? It was the kind of queen of the sciences. And a way to think of it is it was the science of the infinites, of the true, the beautiful, and the good. Here he comes. Mr. Luber. So I'll go back to the technical Trinity thing. So, but friends.
My phone died. I'm listening to you so much.
No, it died.
Literally, you're like bringing me to tears with how.
I'm loving you. And so like I was saying, the Christian Trinity is a helpful metaphor because practically the persons of the Trinity are all the same, but technically they are not. So the Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are practically the same, but technically they are not. That's the weird thing. So practically, theme and beauty are always together and isomorphic. But technically, there's a distinction because theme is the command beauty puts on your life, and then beauty goes away. And in a way, the theme then sets the boundary condition of the development of your good. That's why it then slips immediately into good. Because you have your theme, go now, you can be good. But it's given to you by the beautiful, if you will. And this is like the language in Christianity is the Son is beget by the Father. Beget is a weird term, but it's very important because it means you share in the substance. Like if I give you a cup, I'm distinct from the cup. But if theoretically I could beget a cup, the cup would actually be part of my being somehow, if you will, right? So beauty begets theme. Beauty begets theme. Theme is of the same kind of ontological substance as beauty, but it's a begetting in the same way that the Son is beget by the Father, and then the Holy Spirit is beget by the Son, if you will. There's a begetting that occurs. And so beauty begets a command. You must change your life based on the will curcumin, or once you're inspired to be a writer, the beauty of the movie you saw then commands you to become a film writer. Like you're now commanded, you're given a theme. But the beauty gives you the theme so quickly that they seem identical. Like it's like like you cannot have beauty as distinct from a mere aesthetic and there not be a command. Therefore, you now know how to be good. The moment you get the theme, what do you know how to be good because you got the thematic command. Beauty begets the theme, and now you know how to be good. And then alignment with the theme is alignment with the beautiful. So you say, therefore it was good. The beauty had to have been good because it gave me the standard of the good, which is the theme. And it couldn't have done that if the good wasn't somehow part of it. So that's where you that's where Christians will say knowing Jesus knows the Father, even though you can never access the Father. Because if Jesus was beget by the Father, then if you know Jesus, you somehow mysteriously know the inaccessible God, right? And so likewise, if you know the theme and you follow the theme, you somehow know the beauty of which you can never fully access because it was beget by that beauty, right? And so now you have, and this is the key, now you have the possibility of a univocal plurality because everyone is given unique themes, but they all experience the same beauty, the same thing that gives you commands, which, they would call God. And you mentioned this. So this is very important. Theology, please, Mr. Luber.
I'm sorry. No, I didn't mean to cut you off. I mean, let me just squeeze in. Yeah, I'm loving this too. This is really elucidating a lot for me as well, Michelle. It seems like Nazis are when they're so thematic, but they forget that beauty leaves.
Yes, that's literally.
I just wanted to squeeze. Okay, that's because like there is something, and I always struggled with this. It's like, because I'm Jewish, it's like there is something very thematic
Yes.
about Nazism.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
knowing
Yes.
like the German idealism roots a little bit. And now I get it really clicks why they suck at the end
Yes.
of the day. It's
Yes. Yes.
so, okay.
Everything, the greatest horrors in history, if you are often start in a beauty that gives a theme that forgets the beauty. And precisely because the theme came from the beauty, it, if you will, has the power of God. That's why it's so devastating. Like, you know, when a theme when a theme forsakes, you know, Heidegger talks about forgetting the origin, right? This notion of the forsaking. When theme forgets the beauty, then it has no corrective. It then becomes its own end and justification, and you get Nazism and different things. So, hey, you know, a good example. What did Christians do when they forgot that Jesus is beget by the Father of the Torah, of whom is that God? Anti-Semitism. The radical, horrific anti-Semitism of Christianity is when Jesus is separated from the Father. And when does Christianity also become dogmatic and neurotic? When they forget the Holy Spirit, because then they're just following the dogmas of the church without any creativity because they don't have the Spirit. Whenever you forget the source, if you will, from which everything is beget, you have no corrective. And in a way, theme then gets a life of its own without that beauty, which then means it's a good without the beauty. And once that occurs, you can be true to that good, but it won't be beautiful, and now it can be Nazism. But if you have beauty, here's the problem. This is where Jockin is saying beauty is the highest, because this would be the argument. It is actually not possible to truly have beauty and not have a theme. This is the key move. Because if you are encountering beauty without a theme, it's actually just an aesthetic. You think it's beautiful, but if it didn't automatically give you a theme, it's not beauty. It's just an aesthetic. This is where Plato and them are like, well, beauty is the highest because beauty always gives you a theme. But the problem is we've not been able to identify the distinction, in my opinion, between beauty, as Jockin is talking about, and the aesthetic of the cherry blossom, because we're missing a word, I think. That's why I'm talking about meta-aesthetic. That's why I'm talking about aesthetic. And that's what Jockin was getting at, where we've lost the word. Beauty always commands. And if you find something aesthetically pleasing and it doesn't force you to change your life in very uncomfortable ways, here's the other thing. Beauty commands you to do things that are freaking nuts. Like, that's another thing. Your theme doesn't give a darn. Like, it's uncomfortable? Oh, you're not going to have money? Everyone's going to hate you? Sorry, it's your theme. Beauty spoke. And you now have to choose between being a devil or rising to the occasion. Can't go back, sorry. Like, that's the other thing. That's why beauty has a kind of horror to it, if you will. Because when God shows up and says, hey, Moses, guess what? You're going to do X, Y, and Z. And Moses is like, no, I really don't want to. Sorry, I spoke. Too late. You now have your theme. So there's a way in which, like, there's this history of God showing up being like a, oh, frick moment. We all could die. Yep, because you're about to find the theme, and once you know the theme, like we talked about in the book, you can't unknow it without it being a what? Tragedy. The failure to match the theme is a tragedy. It can't be a commedia. So once God shows up and gives you a theme, you either do it or it's a tragedy. So do not summon beauty lightly. And we haven't. We've waited over 2,024 years. But now you're at a saturation of the end of true history where you have to make the absolute choice into absolute history that is willing to create the conditions of the encounter of beauty and the theme that would be commanded thusly, because otherwise it's the Nickland AI. Please, Mr. Luber.
Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. I just want that missing, like, to me, theme isn't mine. Like, I never felt like it was, because I really did. I just think that is the word for it. Like, it's just what's appropriate. Like, I was only thinking about storytelling, like in this, like, you're talking about the grand everything. I was thinking about it literally with just storytelling, like just what I do out here. And I think it's just really ironic that I didn't anticipate this at all. Like, I literally didn't think I would ever have that it would become something that's outside of just like someone trying to write a script initially, which is funny in a certain sense. It's pretty funny. So yeah, I just wanted to squeeze that in. You're unbelievable. So
You're kind. Well, the thing is, beauty. If beauty never shows up in your life, you're stuck in the ironic situation. You never escape irony. But if beauty shows up and now you have a command, you could end up in a tragedy. Like when you're in the ironic situation, you don't have to worry about a tragedy. You're stuck in the lukewarm in a sense, right? Well, you're not going to have a tragedy and you're not going to be a demon, but you're stuck in the ironic situation. Once beauty shows up and gives you a command, a commedia is possible, a happy ending, as Dante talks about. But precisely because a happy ending is possible, it is also possible to have a tragedy. You cannot not have both, right? When a command shows up, it always brings the possibility of both. So we said, screw that. And we went with neoliberalism, capitalism, and said, we'll just be fine. We'll be fine. So we went with capitalism, capital, won the Cold War, all good. Turns out, though, that there's a point where the ironic situation becomes costly, and you have to escape the irony because now you're heading toward what is called the meta crisis or the AI and all of these different things. So the ironic situation turned out to have an expiration date, and that is now collectively forcing, at a saturation point to bring in Ebert and Hegel, a forcing of a collective encounter of beauty, an encounter of the thing of which such commands. Because if we do not, then we're stuck in an irony that, of course, AI captures. So then there's this issue in history. It's like, how do you get everyone to be thematic? History's taking care of it. It is going to, and we may find out that we do not want that because now a tragedy is possible instead of a commedia, right? The lukewarm age is, in a sense, being saturated. That it's being saturated, which then brings the unveiling of the encounter of the beautiful, which brings with it the command of the theme that then forces you, pins you down. And like Nabokov says, once you see, you can't unsee. Once you're pinned down, you can't not be pinned down, and you must make the absolute choice. The absolute choice is now necessary. Please, Mr. Luber.
it's like the causer, the origin of the causer in the story is ironically the same thing that's happening to you in real life.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
Just in real life, you would just call it beauty.
Yes.
But like in terms of just writing a story, it would be a little weird sounding to call it beauty.
Yes,
but it basically is the same thing.
it is the same thing.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it's all the same.
Really...
They talk about it's all isomorphic up the entire chain of being. They talk about the hierarchy of being, different thing. It all has the same structure, but it is particularized relative to the particular subject. Therefore, it is not totalitarian. That's the sacred romance. It's able to meet everyone in different ways so that they are able to individualize, but also be part of something that is intelligible to everyone else because there's a resemblance in the structure. And history follows that as well. And because there is this meta intelligibility possible because of this situation we are describing, it is not technically impossible to have sithome belonging. If all of this is thus, if this structure is part of being, if you will, then a sithome belonging is possible versus an authority-based belonging in attuning and aligning with the structure we are describing. If this is part of being, there is theoretically something that people could align with and thus find belonging in, and it be sithome, a practice versus authority, law, command, big other based. You see? So if this describes reality, which there is reason to think does, as hopefully things like experiments of the net or philosophy or story writing or the phenomenology of the artist show, all of this provides evidence that this structure is thus. Thus, there would be reason to think that efforts to create belonging based on this metastructure are not inherently doomed to fail. Thus, the effort would be worth putting in and the time, energy, and the investment would be worth it. Then that would then lead having a process of gathering data to think that this would be worth trying to implement as a basis of a political economy, as the basis of a sociological order. Please, Mr. Luber.
I know you got to go way over time. But just for people listening, that doesn't, if you do your belonging based off that metastructure, that doesn't mean that it's fixed at all. Like it's like it could really quickly, I think, sound like, oh, you're talking about like a fixed position. but it's that it now changes according to how the metastructure relates to being in the world.
Yes.
And like
Correct.
that is an ongoing thing. So I think it's fixed toward something right now. It's just not that.
Yes.
I don't even know what you would call it. So like it's like a
Well,
obfuscated version of that.
Classically, they would say it was ordered but not fixed, like the dancing, like in the orbits. It had an orbit, but it didn't have a kind of mechanic structure. And that's exactly right. Like it's a moving position. A dance moves. A dance has logic and steps, and yet it is not predictable ahead of time. This is the key. Like the metastructure allows a collective structure that is more like a dance than a machine. But for that to occur, people have to meet the condition of one, knowing that metastructure is there, and then committing themselves to attuning to that structure. Ergo, spreading the conditions of the encounter of beauty is very important, because basically, if we don't do that, people are still going to be commanded by a theme, but it will be one they experience primarily as terror versus wonder, because it will be the terror of AI, and it'll probably be pathological. Like, when the absolute, so the absolute choice is the response to the theme of beauty. The command of beauty, the command of the causer, is what the absolute choice is in regarding to. If the causer is terrifying, like Nick Land's Capital, we will likely, in the condition of the absolute choice, either choose it in a inefficient and problematic way that will lead us to a tragedy, or we'll try to avoid the choice, which means we stay in the ironic situation and thus are self-effaced, right? Because once you see the command, you have to act or else. Self-effacement, right? So if the causer is Nick Land's AI, which history is basically, as we talked about, leading to, we will likely fail the absolute choice, if you will, or it will be a tragedy. But if the causer was like the AI, but it was actually beauty-based primarily, which would be possible with spreading the conditions of, say, net conversations or the classroom or all the stuff Belonging Again is to talk about, then the theme, because the premise of Belonging Again is that a collective theme is inevitable now. A collective theme is now inevitable. A command is coming, and we will either be ready for it or not. We will, as subjects, have developed the goodness to a sufficient degree to be able to handle that theme, or we will not. So that's the underlying premise. The theme is coming. A command is coming. An encounter of something is coming. If it is primarily beauty-based, then that command will be one of inspiration and something we'll be excited to respond to and address. But we have to spread things like the net. We have to spread the social conditions in which people can go, wow, there's some sort of apathetic lack at the center of reality that we can orbit and have conditions of possibility transform and be the kind of subjects that can participate in those things. Oh, wow, the command that you must change your life is a wonderful thing, because had I never received that command, I wouldn't have changed my life. And how sad would it have been if I would have kept my life the way that it was in an ironic situation and not even known I was in an ironic situation? I'm so glad I was given a command to change my life that had I not received, I wouldn't have even known that I didn't receive. Like Kierkegaard, and that's irony, of course. That's Kierkegaard's total depravity. But on the flip side, if AI shows up as the basis of the command of you must change your life, we haven't done the work to be ready for that command. We haven't done the work to be able to handle that. And so it will be a terror. It would be God. It's both, in a way, the encounter of God, because you mentioned that. Well, God, critically, in classical thought, God can reduce you to ash. Like, God is terrified. Because God is the ultimate beauty, God can kill you, right? Like, if you look at God, it's like Lovecraft. You get reduced to ash. But if you look at God through Beatrice, through beauty, then you can encounter God without being destroyed, because it becomes analogous. It becomes an analogous relationship with God, right? And so likewise, when we have an because what AI, the reason I say this is because AI is going to force humans to realize that there's basically nothing that humans can do that AI cannot do. So there's a certain lack in differentiation, right? And in that lack you encounter, and I have to go in a moment as well, in that lack you then have a choice. Wow, what is it to be human then? Why be human? If there's no difference between the AI and the human being, if it can do everything, why? I'm now commanded to ask that question, and I don't have a good answer. So it's a tragedy. Inevitably, it will just turn into pathology and all these other things. But if you encounter beauty and AI shows up, and you ask, why be human if AI is here? It's because AI cannot encounter your beauty. AI cannot transform you into the subject that beauty can transform you into. AI cannot help you escape irony, actually. If you want to escape an ironic situation, only beauty can do that. And only the human can have an analogous relationship. AI can't have an analogous relationship. Analogous meaning you are able to experience something in something else, okay? In like a metaphor. In A, you experience B. In Beatrice is analogous to God, right? And so Dante in Beatrice is able to have an experience of God without committing heresy, right? So likewise, what ends up happening is only humans can have analogous knowledge. AI can only have knowledge that is very direct, to the point that saturates all possibilities of knowing that are not analogous. AI can be an incredibly useful tool to helping us get good at analogous. And maybe one day AI will be capable of the analogous thought as well, and then that will be another saturation point of another theme that will demand another development of the subject. But the point is this: beauty invites analogous thinking. And beauty invites the human to get good at seeing something in philosophy, in a conversation like the net. You are here and also not here at the same time. You're talking with friends, but you're also in some other place. You're here, there. There's this thought you're part of. You're in this thought, but you're also just on a computer. There's a here, there-ness going on, a both-ness that is going on. An analogous relationship is present. A is in B. A is not merely A is also B. AB is always a movement in an analogous relationship, right? So here's the key. You mentioned the point that it sounded like we were saying we could bring God to us in a way, because we could bring beauty to us, right? And beauty is definitely associated with God. And keep in mind, you cannot encounter God without having a command on your life. It's just like beauty. If you encounter God, you're commanded to do something about it. There's a kind of change that occurs, right? So in beauty, there's a kind of command that comes with it, right? This sounds like it is a risk of then committing like an ultimate heresy, right? This is where theology, because another way, theology was the queen of the sciences. So it is the science of how to relate to the infinite, the true, the beautiful, and the good, while keeping them infinite. Well, this was an incredibly difficult science then, because you had to operate within the finite while keeping the infinite distinct from the finite, but the finite participating in the infinite. How do you do that? This is why Aquinas talks about the analogy of being. This is why Austin Farrer thanks people like Karl Barth, saying that the word lowercase g goodness has nothing to do with capital G goodness as a problem. Many of the theologians, and I think they're correct, say that we know God analogously. Likewise, we know beauty analogously, meaning we know something of God that has a meaningful connection with God or beauty, but also is so infinitely less than God that to say that it is God was the case until you thought about it. This is the funny thing. The thing that you encounter as beautiful and say, wow, this was beautiful, well, now you're actually bringing it into the realm of finitude. So there's always a sense annihilation that has to occur to maintain the analogy in a non-idolatrous way. There is always a negative pragmatism to maintain the analogy, the analogous relationship, so that you don't slip into a heresy that then leads to the Lovecraftian self-effacement. Because you need a kind of analogous relationship to meaninglessly connect with the beautiful and to spread the conditions of the beautiful without reducing the beautiful to the aesthetic, thus losing the theme. That's all analogous. That's all in AB. Well, the best philosophical conversations have an analogous character. As they're talking about something that they don't know they're going to talk about, and then they're talking about it, and it moves. There's an analogous movement that's occurring, right? You go into a conversation not knowing what you're going to talk about, but as you talk about it, you know that's what you're talking about. And it always has a developmental character. You start a screenplay knowing what it's going to be about, but you also don't know what's going to be about. But as it develops, it speaks analogously to this thing that is there and not there at the same time, that you are meaningfully participating in, but not reducing the thing you're participating in to your participation. Theology, at its best, was always a question of how to be analogous without being heretical. Likewise, a science of beauty would be a question of how to meaningfully participate and spread the conditions of beauty without reducing beauty to something that makes it not beautiful, which would then collapse the beautiful with the good, create theme without the beautiful, and now you have the meta-aesthetic of Nazism that is a violence and that is oppressive, right? So the science of beauty has something to do with the art of staying analogous. And in that analogous, you spread the conditions of the analogy so that more and more people can do it. Thus, the possibility of sithome belonging at scale becomes possible. And thus, the kind of subjects who are able to think according to that beauty and have that command on their life and not respond to it pathologically, but actually respond to it in a manner that is inspiring and increases the conditions of wonder. It's always a pleasure, Mr. Luber. Thank you for your time. And Chetan, thank you for staying up till 6 a.m. in the morning. I appreciate it very much. Thank you all.